What if everything you thought you knew about the Silk Road was fundamentally wrong? What if the greatest trade network in human history began not with merchants seeking profit, but with a desperate emperor gambling his dynasty's survival on a single man's impossible journey into the unknown? The year was 138 BC. Emperor Wu of Han sat upon the dragon throne, ruler of the most populous civilization on Earth, yet haunted by a terror that kept him awake through countless nights. Beyond the Great Wall, in the endless grasslands that stretched toward the edge of the world, the Xiongnu horsemen were gathering. These fierce nomadic warriors had humiliated his predecessors, forcing the Han to pay tribute in silk, grain, and even imperial princesses. The shame burned like acid in Emperor Wu's veins. But the young emperor possessed something his predecessors had lacked: intelligence reports about a displaced people called the Yuezhi, driven westward by Xiongnu attacks decades earlier. If he could find these exiled warriors and forge an alliance, China could crush the Xiongnu between two armies, like grain between millstones. It was a plan born of desperation, requiring someone to cross territories no Chinese had ever mapped, through lands ruled by the very enemies he sought to destroy. Zhang Qian was not a warrior. He was a palace attendant, a man whose greatest skill lay in navigating the treacherous politics of the imperial court. Yet when Emperor Wu called for volunteers to undertake this suicidal mission, Zhang Qian stepped forward. Perhaps he sought glory. Perhaps he believed in the emperor's vision. Perhaps he simply understood that refusing would be more dangerous than accepting. Whatever his motivation, his decision would reshape the world. The expedition departed Chang'an with approximately 100 men, including a Xiongnu guide named Ganfu, who had defected to the Chinese and possessed crucial knowledge of the Western territories. They carried silk for trade, weapons for defense, and imperial credentials that would mean nothing in lands where Chinese authority was unknown. Zhang Qian understood that he was leading his men into a void, a vast emptiness on Chinese maps marked only with speculation and legend. The catastrophe came swiftly. Within weeks of crossing into Xiongnu territory, the entire expedition was captured. The Xiongnu commander, recognizing the diplomatic nature of the mission, chose not to execute his prisoners. Instead, he offered Zhang Qian a choice that was no choice at all: live among the Xiongnu as a comfortable captive, or die. Zhang Qian chose to live. For more than a decade, Zhang Qian existed in a strange limbo between prisoner and guest. The Xiongnu gave him a wife from their own people, and she bore him children. He learned their language, observed their customs, and studied their military techniques with the careful attention of a man who never forgot his mission. The Xiongnu bred horses using methods unknown in China, selecting for speed, endurance, and temperament across generations. Their cavalry tactics, based on mobility and archery from horseback, had made them masters of the steppe. Zhang Qian memorized everything, but he also watched. He noted the trade goods that flowed through Xiongnu camps: jade from distant mountains, gold from unknown sources, textiles woven in styles no Chinese artisan had ever seen. The Xiongnu were not isolated barbarians, but nodes in a vast network of exchange that stretched far beyond Chinese knowledge. Somewhere out there, civilizations existed that China had never imagined. Around 129 BC, during a period of internal Xiongnu political turmoil, Zhang Qian saw his opportunity. He gathered the survivors of his original expedition, perhaps a dozen men who had endured captivity alongside him, and fled westward. His Xiongnu wife and children he left behind, a sacrifice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The mission came first. It always had to come first. The journey that followed would have broken lesser men. Zhang Qian and his companions crossed the Taklamakan Desert, a wasteland so hostile that its name meant "go in and you won't come out" in the local Turkic languages. Summer temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, while winter brought killing cold. Water sources were separated by distances that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. The shifting sand dunes erased all landmarks, making navigation a matter of celestial observation and desperate hope. They climbed the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, where peaks exceeded 20,000 feet, and the thin air made every step an exhausting struggle. Altitude sickness claimed some of his men, their bodies unable to adapt to conditions no Chinese had ever experienced. Avalanches and sudden storms threatened constantly. The survivors pressed on, driven by Zhang Qian's iron determination and the knowledge that turning back meant death or recapture. When they finally reached Bactria, in what is now northern Afghanistan, Zhang Qian found the Yuezhi. But the diplomatic reality proved devastating. The Yuezhi had prospered in their new homeland, establishing a wealthy kingdom with access to established trade routes. They had no interest in mounting costly military campaigns against enemies they had fled decades ago. The Xiongnu were a distant memory, irrelevant to their current prosperity. Zhang Qian's mission had failed. Yet in that failure lay the seeds of something far greater than military alliance. Walking through Bactrian markets, Zhang Qian encountered Chinese silk being sold at prices that would have seemed fantastical in Chang'an. The fabric had traveled through multiple intermediaries, each transaction adding substantial markup, until it commanded values that made the original production costs seem trivial. He saw Chinese lacquerware in elite households, Chinese bronze mirrors displayed as symbols of prestige. Goods from his homeland had somehow reached these distant markets through channels no Chinese official had ever documented. Zhang Qian understood immediately what this meant. The Xiongnu were not the only path westward. Trade routes existed, connecting China with civilizations that possessed goods Chinese consumers would pay fortunes to acquire. The military mission had failed, but Zhang Qian had discovered something potentially more valuable: the economic foundation for an empire. The return journey proved equally hazardous. Xiongnu forces captured Zhang Qian's party again, and he spent another year in captivity before escaping during yet another period of political instability. When he finally reached Chinese territory in 126 BC, 13 years after his departure, only he and Ganfu remained from the original expedition. The others had died in captivity, perished in the desert, or fallen in the mountains. Zhang Qian had lost everything except the knowledge he carried in his mind. Emperor Wu received Zhang Qian's reports with the intensity of a man who recognized transformative intelligence. The diplomatic failure mattered little compared to the commercial possibilities Zhang Qian described. Here was a way to project Chinese power westward without the enormous costs of military conquest. Here was a source of revenue that could fund the armies needed to finally defeat the Xiongnu. Here was a vision of Chinese influence extending to the edges of the known world. The emperor's response demonstrated a sophistication that would characterize Han commercial policy for generations. Rather than abandoning Western engagement, he authorized Zhang Qian's second expedition in 115 BC with explicitly commercial objectives. This mission carried substantial quantities of Chinese silk, lacquerware, and metalwork as trade goods rather than diplomatic gifts. Technical specialists accompanied the expedition to assess foreign products and identify profitable import opportunities. Zhang Qian was no longer a diplomat seeking allies. He was a commercial pioneer opening markets. The second journey established direct contact with kingdoms that would become crucial nodes in the emerging trade network. Fergana-bred horses that Chinese military commanders coveted for their cavalry units, animals superior to anything available within Chinese territories. Sogdian merchants demonstrated remarkable skill in long-distance trade organization, maintaining networks that connected Indian, Persian, and Mediterranean markets. Parthian territories provided access to luxury goods from the Roman Empire. including glassware, precious stones, and exotic spices that Chinese consumers had never encountered. Zhang Qian returned with more than trade agreements. He brought back knowledge of grape cultivation and wine production, previously unknown in China. He introduced alfalfa, which would revolutionize Chinese horse breeding by providing superior fodder. He described technologies and artistic traditions that would influence Chinese culture for centuries. The Silk Road had not yet received its name, but its foundations were being laid with every piece of intelligence Zhang Qian delivered to the imperial court. The Han government's systematic approach to Western trade development involved establishing official markets in frontier cities where foreign merchants could exchange goods under Chinese supervision. These controlled trading posts allowed imperial officials to collect customs duties while monitoring the flow of strategic materials. The city of Dunhuang, positioned at the gateway to the Western territories, became the primary checkpoint for goods moving in both directions. Merchants entering Chinese territory submitted to inspection and taxation, while those departing carried documentation certifying the legal origin of their goods. Silk manufacturing represented China's most closely guarded technological secret, and the Han government intended to keep it that way. The complex process of silkworm cultivation, cocoon harvesting, and thread production required specialized knowledge passed down through generations of artisan families. Chinese authorities imposed severe penalties on anyone attempting to export silkworms or reveal production techniques to foreigners. This monopoly ensured that all silk reaching Western markets originated from Chinese sources, creating a dependable revenue stream that would fund imperial ambitions for centuries. The formation of regular trade networks required solving logistical challenges that would have seemed insurmountable to earlier generations. Merchants needed reliable information about route conditions, seasonal weather patterns, and political stability in transit regions. The Han government began maintaining diplomatic relationships with various Central Asian rulers, specifically to ensure safe passage for Chinese trading expeditions. These arrangements often involved annual tribute payments or gift exchanges that guaranteed protection for merchant caravans, creating a web of obligations and benefits that stabilized commercial operations across thousands of miles. Emperor Wu's Western policies transformed China from an inward-looking agricultural empire into a commercial power with interests spanning the known world. The revenues generated by silk exports funded military campaigns that finally broke Xiongnu power, vindicating the strategic vision that had sent Zhang Qian into the unknown decades earlier. But the consequences extended far beyond military victory. China had discovered that trade could be a weapon more powerful than any army, a tool for projecting influence without the costs of conquest. Zhang Qian died around 113 BC, honored by the emperor, but largely forgotten by history, until modern scholars recognized his extraordinary achievements. He had spent 13 years as a captive, crossed some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, and failed in his original mission. Yet his observations and recommendations had created the foundation for the most significant trade network in ancient history. The Silk Road began not with merchants seeking profit, but with a palace attendant who refused to abandon his mission despite impossible odds. The routes Zhang Qian had pioneered would carry more than silk in the centuries to come. Ideas, religions, technologies, and diseases would travel these pathways, transforming every civilization they touched. The world before Zhang Qian's journey and the world after were fundamentally different places, connected in ways that would have seemed magical to earlier generations. All because one man stepped forward when an emperor called for volunteers, and refused to give up even when everything seemed lost. In the year 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus led 7 Roman legions into the Parthian desert seeking glory that would rival his fellow triumvirs Caesar and Pompey. What he found instead was annihilation. At the Battle of Carrhae, Parthian horse archers destroyed his army with a tactical sophistication the Romans had never encountered. 20,000 legionaries died in the sand, 10,000 more were captured and marched into captivity in the distant east. Crassus himself was killed, his severed head reportedly used as a prop in a Parthian theatrical performance. But the disaster at Carrhae introduced Rome to something that would prove more transformative than any military defeat: silk. The Parthian battle standards, captured Roman soldiers reported, were made of a fabric unlike anything in the Mediterranean world. It shimmered in the desert sun, lighter than linen yet stronger than wool, flowing like liquid metal in the wind. The Romans had encountered Chinese silk, and they would never be the same. Within a generation, silk had become the most coveted luxury in the Roman Empire. Wealthy women draped themselves in fabrics so fine they were nearly transparent, scandalizing conservative senators who complained that Roman matrons were appearing in public essentially naked. The philosopher Seneca thundered against silk garments that reveal the body rather than clothe it, but his protests only increased demand among fashionable Romans eager to demonstrate their sophistication and wealth. The economics of Roman silk consumption were staggering. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, estimated that Rome spent 100 million sesterces annually on luxury imports from the East, with silk comprising the largest single category. This figure represented roughly 2% of the entire imperial budget, an enormous sum flowing eastward in exchange for fabric that weighed almost nothing. Roman gold and silver coins traveled thousands of miles to pay for silk that Chinese artisans had produced for a fraction of its final selling price. The Roman fascination with silk reflected deeper cultural currents than mere fashion. The fabric's exotic origin, from lands so distant that no Roman had ever visited them, gave silk an almost magical quality. Wearing silk demonstrated not just wealth but worldliness, a connection to civilizations beyond the Mediterranean that most Romans could barely imagine. The fabric became a status symbol precisely because it was so difficult to obtain, so expensive to acquire, and so obviously foreign to Roman traditions. Roman merchants developed sophisticated techniques for marketing Chinese silk to maximize profits within the empire's established commercial networks. They discovered that Roman consumers preferred silk dyed in specific colors, particularly the deep purples associated with imperial authority and the rich reds that complemented Roman aesthetic preferences. This market intelligence traveled back along trade routes, influencing Chinese production decisions and creating the first examples of international market adaptation in silk manufacturing. The Parthian Empire's strategic position between Roman and Chinese territories allowed Parthian merchants to establish themselves as indispensable intermediaries in the silk trade. These traders maintained permanent representatives in both Roman Syria and Chinese frontier cities, creating communication networks that transmitted market information across thousands of miles. Parthian merchant families developed expertise in currency exchange, language interpretation, and diplomatic protocols that proved essential for facilitating transactions between parties who rarely met face to face. Parthian control over Western trade route segments enabled them to implement sophisticated pricing strategies that maximized their profits while maintaining sufficient price predictability to encourage continued Roman investment in silk purchases. They established standardized markup rates for different categories of goods, with silk commanding the highest premiums due to its exceptional demand in Roman markets. Parthian merchants also developed quality grading systems that allowed Roman buyers to specify desired silk characteristics without physically examining the goods before purchase. The journey of silk from Chinese workshops to Roman consumers involved a chain of transactions that could span 2 years or more. Chinese silk producers in the Yangtze River Valley sold their output to merchants who transported it to frontier trading posts like Dunhuang. There, the silk changed hands again, purchased by Central Asian traders who carried it across the Taklamakan Desert to oasis cities like Kashgar and Khotan. Sogdian merchants acquired the silk in these markets and transported it through the Pamir Mountains to Bactrian trading centers. Parthian traders then carried the goods across their empire to Syrian ports, where Roman merchants finally took possession and shipped the silk to markets throughout the Mediterranean world. Each transaction in this chain added substantial markup to the silk's price. A bolt of silk that cost perhaps 10 denarii to produce in China might sell for 100 denarii in Kashgar, 500 denarii in Bactria, and 2,000 denarii or more in Rome. The merchants who facilitated these transactions bore significant risks, including banditry, political instability, and the ever-present dangers of desert and mountain travel. Their profits reflected compensation for these risks, as much as simple commercial markup. The Roman government made periodic attempts to reduce dependence on Parthian intermediaries by establishing direct contact with Chinese authorities. In 97 AD, the Chinese general Ban Chao sent an envoy named Gan Ying westward with instructions to reach the Roman Empire and establish diplomatic relations. Gan Ying traveled as far as the Persian Gulf, where Parthian merchants convinced him that the sea voyage to Roman territory would take 2 years and was extremely dangerous. Discouraged, Gan Ying turned back, and the opportunity for direct Sino-Roman contact was lost. The Parthians had good reason to discourage direct communication between their 2 largest trading partners. Their entire commercial position depended on maintaining their role as essential intermediaries. If Romans and Chinese could trade directly, Parthian merchants would lose the lucrative markup they extracted from every transaction. The Parthians' successful manipulation of Gan Ying demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of commercial geopolitics and their willingness to use deception to protect their economic interests. Roman consumers remained largely ignorant of silk's true origins, believing various myths about its production. Some thought silk grew on trees, combed from leaves like cotton. Others believed it was produced by giant spiders or extracted from the petals of exotic flowers. The Chinese carefully cultivated this ignorance, understanding that mystery enhanced silk's value and protected their manufacturing monopoly. Any Roman who learned the truth about silkworm cultivation would have been astonished to discover that the most expensive fabric in the world was produced by caterpillars eating mulberry leaves. The silk trade's impact on Roman society extended far beyond fashion and economics. The constant outflow of precious metals to pay for Eastern luxuries contributed to monetary instability that would plague the empire for centuries. Roman mines could not produce gold and silver fast enough to replace what flowed eastward, leading to gradual debasement of the currency and inflationary pressures that undermined economic stability. Some historians argue that Rome's addiction to silk and other Eastern luxuries contributed significantly to the empire's eventual decline. The trade also introduced Romans to goods and ideas that would transform their culture in unexpected ways. Spices from India and Southeast Asia revolutionized Roman cuisine, while incense from Arabia became essential for religious ceremonies. Precious stones from various Eastern sources created new categories of jewelry and decorative arts. Perhaps most significantly, the trade routes that carried silk westward also carried religious ideas, including Buddhism and eventually Christianity, that would reshape the spiritual landscape of the ancient world. Roman attempts to develop domestic silk production consistently failed due to lack of knowledge about silkworm cultivation. The Chinese monopoly remained unbroken until the 6th century AD. When Byzantine Emperor Justinian allegedly arranged for monks to smuggle silkworm eggs out of China, hidden in hollow bamboo walking sticks. Even then, Byzantine silk production never matched Chinese quality, and Chinese silk remained the premium product in international markets for centuries afterward. The Roman obsession with silk created demand that would sustain the Silk Road trade network for generations. Long after the Roman Empire collapsed, the desire for Chinese silk continued to drive commercial relationships across Eurasia. The patterns established during the Roman period, including the role of intermediary merchants, the importance of quality grading systems, and the use of precious metals as the primary medium of exchange, would characterize Silk Road commerce for over a millennium. The legacy of Roman silk consumption extended beyond economics to influence how later generations understood the relationship between East and West. The image of Roman matrons draped in Chinese silk, of Roman gold flowing eastward to pay for exotic luxuries, became a powerful symbol of the connections that had linked distant civilizations in the ancient world. When 19th century scholars began studying these trade networks systematically, they drew heavily on Roman sources that documented the empire's fascination with silk and the enormous costs Romans were willing to pay to satisfy their desires. The silk that Parthian soldiers displayed at Carrhae had been intended to intimidate Roman legionaries with evidence of Parthian wealth and sophistication. Instead, it sparked a commercial relationship that would outlast both empires, connecting civilizations across thousands of miles and transforming cultures on both ends of the trade routes. Marcus Crassus had sought military glory and found only death, but his defeat introduced Rome to a fabric that would reshape the ancient world's economy and create connections that would endure for millennia. The Tarim Basin should not exist. Surrounded by some of the highest mountain ranges on Earth, cut off from moisture-bearing winds by peaks that scrape the edge of space, this vast depression in the heart of Central Asia receives less rainfall than the Sahara Desert. The Taklamakan, which fills most of the basin's floor, is one of the most hostile environments humans have ever attempted to cross. Summer temperatures exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter brings killing cold that can drop to -20 degrees. Sandstorms lasting for days bury everything in their path. The name itself, in local Turkic languages, translates roughly as place of no return. Yet along the edges of this wasteland, where snowmelt from surrounding mountains creates ribbons of fertility in an otherwise dead landscape, some of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world flourished for over a millennium. Kashgar, Khotan, Kucha, Turfan, and dozens of smaller settlements became nodes in a commercial network that connected the world's greatest civilizations. The merchants who operated from these oasis cities developed expertise in long-distance trade that would not be matched until the modern era. Kashgar, positioned at the western edge of the Tarim Basin, where multiple mountain passes converge, became the primary gateway between Chinese territories and Central Asian markets. The city's location made it a natural gathering point for merchant caravans heading in every direction, east toward China, west toward Persia and the Mediterranean, south toward India, north toward the steppes. Kashgar's markets featured specialized sections for different categories of goods, with silk merchants occupying the most prestigious locations near the city center. The city's commercial infrastructure reflected centuries of accumulated expertise in facilitating long-distance trade. Caravanserais provided secure accommodation for traveling merchants, with separate facilities for different nationalities and religious groups. Money changers maintained current exchange rates for dozens of currencies, enabling transactions between parties using different monetary systems. Interpreters fluent in multiple languages facilitated negotiations between merchants who shared no common tongue. Scribes prepared contracts in various scripts, creating legal documentation that would be recognized across different jurisdictions. Khotan, along the southern rim of the Tarim Basin, developed particular expertise in jade processing and luxury textile production. The region's jade deposits had been exploited for millennia, but growing Chinese demand for high-quality jade objects created new commercial opportunities during the Silk Road era. Khotan's craftsmen developed sophisticated techniques for carving jade into decorative items specifically designed for Chinese markets. Understanding Chinese aesthetic preferences and symbolic associations that determined which designs would command premium prices. The city also became a secondary silk production center, though using different techniques from Chinese methods and producing fabrics with distinct characteristics. Khotan silk, woven from wild silkworms rather than the domesticated varieties cultivated in China, had a slightly different texture and luster that some consumers preferred. The city's weavers also developed expertise in producing carpets and other textiles that combined Chinese silk with local wool, creating hybrid products that appealed to diverse market segments. Kucha, located along the northern route around the Taklamakan, emerged as a major center for Buddhist scholarship and artistic production. The city's monasteries attracted monks from India, China, and various Central Asian regions, creating an intellectual environment where different Buddhist traditions could interact and influence each other. Kucha's cave temples, carved into cliff faces outside the city, contained some of the finest Buddhist art produced anywhere along the Silk Road, featuring distinctive styles that combined Indian iconography with Central Asian and Chinese artistic techniques. The commercial and religious functions of Kucha were closely intertwined. Wealthy merchants funded monastery construction and artistic commissions as acts of religious merit, while monks provided essential services for traveling traders, including accommodation, medical care, and spiritual guidance. The monasteries also served as information centers, where merchants could obtain current intelligence about route conditions, political developments, and market opportunities in distant cities. Turfan, situated in a depression below sea level, offered unique advantages for long-distance travelers, despite its extreme climate. The city's position provided access to reliable water sources and agricultural products, while its location allowed merchants to avoid some of the most difficult mountain crossings. Turfan's residents developed specialized knowledge of desert survival techniques, offering guide services and equipment that proved essential for crossing the Taklamakan. The city's underground irrigation system, known as caravans, represented one of the most sophisticated water management technologies in the ancient world. These underground channels, some extending for miles, carried snowmelt from distant mountains to agricultural fields and urban areas without the evaporation losses that would have made surface irrigation impossible in Turfan's extreme climate. The caravans system enabled Turfan to support a substantial population and produce agricultural surpluses that could be traded with passing caravans. The merchants who operated from these oasis cities developed commercial practices that would influence international trade for centuries. They created standardized quality grading systems for various categories of goods, enabling buyers to specify desired characteristics without physically examining merchandise before purchase. They developed credit arrangements that allowed transactions to occur without immediate exchange of goods or currency, reducing the risks associated with transporting valuable commodities across dangerous territories. Sogdian merchants, originating from the region around Samarkand but establishing communities throughout the Silk Road network, became the most successful commercial operators of the medieval period. Their linguistic abilities, cultural adaptability, and extensive family networks enabled them to facilitate transactions across cultural boundaries that would have been impossible for merchants from more homogeneous backgrounds. Sogdian trading colonies existed in cities from Constantinople to Chang'an, creating a commercial infrastructure that spanned the entire Eurasian continent. The Sogdian language became a lingua franca for Silk Road commerce, used in contracts, correspondence, and negotiations between parties who shared no other common tongue. Sogdian merchants developed standardized commercial terminology and contractual forms that could be understood across different legal systems, reducing the uncertainties that complicated international transactions. Their commercial correspondence, preserved in archaeological discoveries from sites like Dunhuang, reveals sophisticated business practices including partnership arrangements, credit facilities, and insurance mechanisms. The risks facing Silk Road merchants were substantial and varied. Banditry threatened caravans throughout their journeys, with organized criminal groups sometimes controlling entire route segments. Political instability could close routes without warning, stranding merchants in hostile territories with no way to complete their journeys. Natural hazards, including sandstorms, avalanches, and extreme temperatures, claimed lives and destroyed cargo with terrifying regularity. Disease, particularly in the crowded conditions of oasis cities, could devastate merchant communities and disrupt trade for years. Successful merchants developed strategies for managing these risks that anticipated modern insurance and hedging practices. They diversified their investments across multiple caravans and routes, ensuring that no single disaster could destroy their entire business. They maintained relationships with local rulers and military commanders who could provide protection in exchange for payments or commercial privileges. They developed intelligence networks that provided early warning of political changes or road closures, enabling them to adjust their operations before disasters struck. The camel, particularly the Bactrian two-humped variety adapted to Central Asian conditions, made Silk Road commerce possible. These remarkable animals could carry loads of 400 pounds or more across terrain that would kill horses or donkeys. They could survive for days without water, storing fat in their humps that their bodies could metabolize for both energy and moisture. Their broad, padded feet enabled them to walk on sand without sinking, while their thick coats protected them from both summer heat and winter cold. Camel breeding and training became specialized industries in oasis cities, with certain families developing expertise passed down through generations. The best caravan camels commanded premium prices, and merchants invested heavily in acquiring animals with proven endurance and temperament. Camel drivers who understood their animals' needs and capabilities were essential members of any caravan, their skills often determining whether an expedition succeeded or failed. The organization of merchant caravans reflected the complexity of Silk Road commerce. Large caravans might include hundreds of camels carrying goods for dozens of different merchants, along with guards, guides, interpreters, and various support personnel. Caravan leaders, chosen for their experience and judgment, made decisions about routes, timing, and responses to unexpected challenges. The success of these expeditions depended on cooperation between individuals from different backgrounds, creating temporary communities that dissolved when journeys ended. The oasis cities that supported this commerce developed distinctive cultures that reflected their roles as meeting points for diverse civilizations. Their populations included merchants, craftsmen, religious figures, and administrators from across the known world, creating cosmopolitan environments where different languages, religions, and customs coexisted. The art, architecture, and literature produced in these cities combined influences from multiple traditions, creating hybrid forms that could not have emerged in more homogeneous societies. The wealth generated by Silk Road commerce enabled oasis cities to support cultural institutions that rivaled those of much larger civilizations. Libraries collected manuscripts in multiple languages, preserving knowledge from diverse traditions. Schools trained students in commercial skills, religious studies, and various crafts. Temples and monasteries representing different faiths stood side by side, their adherents generally coexisting peacefully despite theological differences. The tolerance and diversity that characterized these cities reflected practical necessities of international commerce as much as philosophical principles. The decline of the oasis cities, when it came, resulted from changes in global trade patterns rather than local failures. When maritime routes around Africa and across the Pacific offered cheaper and safer alternatives to overland travel, the commercial rationale for maintaining these desert settlements disappeared. Cities that had flourished for over a millennium gradually emptied, their populations migrating to regions with better economic prospects. The sand that had always threatened to reclaim the oases finally succeeded, burying the remains of civilizations that had once connected the world. In the year 67 AD, according to Chinese tradition, Emperor Ming of the Han Dynasty experienced a dream that would transform his civilization. He saw a golden figure flying through the air, radiating light that illuminated the entire palace. When he described this vision to his advisors, one scholar recognized the figure as the Buddha, a sage from distant India whose teachings had begun reaching China through merchant travelers along the western trade routes. The emperor dispatched envoys to investigate, and they returned with Buddhist monks, scriptures, and images that established the first official Buddhist presence in China. The story may be legendary, but the transformation it describes was real. Buddhism's arrival in China represented one of the most significant cultural transmissions in human history, a process that would reshape Chinese philosophy, art, literature, and social organization over the following centuries. The religion traveled along the same routes that carried silk westward, demonstrating that the Silk Road transmitted ideas as effectively as it transported goods. Buddhism's appeal to Chinese audiences reflected both the religion's inherent qualities and the specific circumstances of its transmission. The merchants who first carried Buddhist ideas into China were not missionaries but traders who practiced their faith while conducting business. Their success and prosperity suggested that Buddhist practices brought practical benefits, while their cosmopolitan sophistication impressed Chinese observers accustomed to viewing foreigners as barbarians. Buddhism arrived in China associated with wealth, worldliness, and cultural refinement, rather than poverty and asceticism. The Kushan Empire, which controlled crucial segments of the trade routes during the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, played a decisive role in facilitating Buddhist expansion. Kushan rulers, themselves converts to Buddhism, actively promoted the religion, while simultaneously encouraging commercial development. Emperor Kanishka, ruling from approximately 127 to 150 AD, exemplified this dual commitment by commissioning Buddhist art and architecture, while maintaining policies that attracted merchants from across the known world to Kushan territories. Kanishka's capital at Peshawar became a major center for both Buddhist scholarship and international commerce. The city's monasteries housed monks from India, Central Asia, and China who collaborated on translating Sanskrit Buddhist texts into various local languages. These translation projects required extensive knowledge of multiple languages and cultures, skills that the international merchant communities possessed in abundance. Merchants often served as interpreters and cultural mediators, helping monks understand local customs and religious practices that needed to be considered when adapting Buddhist teachings for new audiences. The Gandhara region, encompassing parts of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, emerged as the primary artistic center, where Buddhist iconography absorbed influences from Greek, Roman, Persian, and Central Asian artistic traditions. This cultural synthesis occurred because Gandhara's position along major trade routes brought together artisans and patrons from diverse backgrounds who contributed different aesthetic preferences and technical skills to Buddhist art production. The resulting Gandharan school of Buddhist art featured realistic human figures with Greek-influenced facial features, Roman-style drapery, and Persian decorative motifs, creating a distinctive international artistic language. Gandharan sculptors developed standardized iconographic conventions for depicting Buddhist figures that could be understood across different cultural contexts. These artistic standards traveled along trade routes with merchant caravans, spreading consistent visual representations of Buddhist concepts to distant regions. A merchant familiar with Gandharan Buddhist art could recognize similar iconographic elements in Buddhist sculptures produced in Khotan, Kucha, or Chang'an, creating visual continuity across the vast geographical expanse of the Silk Road network. The monastery complex at Bamiyan, situated in a strategic mountain valley connecting Central Asian steppes with Indian territories, became one of the most important Buddhist centers along the trade routes. The site's massive Buddha statues, carved directly into cliff faces during the 3rd through 6th centuries AD, served multiple functions beyond their obvious religious significance. These monuments marked Bamiyan's location for travelers navigating through complex mountain terrain, while their impressive scale demonstrated the wealth and devotion of the local Buddhist community to passing merchants and pilgrims. Bamiyan's monasteries provided essential services for long-distance travelers, including secure accommodation, medical care, and spiritual guidance. The monks maintained detailed knowledge of regional geography and seasonal travel conditions, offering route advice that proved invaluable for merchant caravans attempting to cross dangerous mountain passes. This practical assistance created positive relationships between Buddhist communities and commercial networks, encouraging merchants to support monastery construction and maintenance through donations and patronage. The transmission of Buddhism to China required extensive adaptation of Indian religious concepts to Chinese philosophical and cultural frameworks. This process involved not just translation of Sanskrit terms into Chinese language, but fundamental reinterpretation of Buddhist ideas to make them comprehensible within Chinese intellectual traditions. Early Chinese Buddhist translators struggled with concepts like karma and rebirth that had no direct equivalents in Chinese thought, leading to creative solutions that combined Buddhist and Chinese ideas in new ways. Kumarajiva, a Buddhist monk from Kucha who reached Chang'an in 401 AD, revolutionized Chinese Buddhism through his translation work and teaching activities. Born to an Indian father and Kuchian mother, Kumarajiva possessed the multicultural background necessary to bridge Indian Buddhist scholarship with Chinese intellectual traditions. His translations of major Mahayana texts, including the Lotus Sutra and works by Nagarjuna, established Chinese Buddhist terminology and interpretive frameworks that influenced Chinese Buddhism for centuries. Kumarajiva's translation methodology emphasized meaning over literal accuracy, allowing him to render complex Sanskrit philosophical concepts in Chinese terms that captured essential Buddhist ideas while remaining comprehensible to Chinese readers. His translation team, which included both Chinese and Central Asian scholars, developed systematic approaches to handling Sanskrit terms that had no Chinese equivalents. These innovations created a distinctively Chinese Buddhist vocabulary that enabled the religion to develop independently of its Indian origins. The Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Faxian, who traveled from China to India between 399 and 414 AD, documented the extensive Buddhist communities he encountered along the Silk Road routes. His detailed travel account describes flourishing monasteries in cities like Khotan, Kashgar, and Gandhara, revealing how completely Buddhism had integrated into the commercial and cultural life of these trading centers. Faxian's observations provide crucial evidence for understanding how Buddhism functioned within Silk Road society during the early 5th century AD. Faxian's journey illustrates the close connections between commercial and religious travel along the Silk Road. He frequently traveled with merchant caravans for security and logistical support, while his religious status provided him with accommodation and assistance from Buddhist communities along his route. His account describes the practical arrangements that enabled long-distance religious travel, including the network of monasteries that provided hospitality for traveling monks and pilgrims. The most famous Chinese Buddhist pilgrim, Xuanzang, undertook his journey to India between 629 and 645 AD during the Tang dynasty's Golden Age. His travels coincided with a period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural exchange along the Silk Road, allowing him to observe Buddhist communities at their peak of development and influence. Xuanzang's detailed records provide comprehensive documentation of Buddhist institutions, practices, and scholarly activities across Central Asia and India during the 7th century AD. Xuanzang's translation work after his return to China represented the culmination of several centuries of Chinese Buddhist development. His translations, produced with support from the Tang imperial court, achieved unprecedented accuracy and completeness in rendering Sanskrit Buddhist texts into Chinese. The Translation Bureau established for Xuanzang's work employed dozens of scholars fluent in Sanskrit, Chinese, and various Central Asian languages, creating the most sophisticated translation operation in medieval history. The cave temples at Dunhuang, carved and decorated between the 4th and 14th centuries AD, represent the most comprehensive record of Buddhist art and culture along the Silk Road. These cave temples, numbering nearly 500 individual chambers, contain Buddhist paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts that document the evolution of Buddhist artistic styles and religious practices across nearly a millennium. The caves also reveal the central role of merchant patronage in supporting Buddhist art production, with many chambers containing donor portraits of wealthy merchants and their families. Dunhuang scriptoriums produced Buddhist texts in multiple languages and scripts, serving the diverse linguistic needs of the international community that frequented the city. Monks and scribes working in Dunhuang created Chinese translations of Sanskrit and Central Asian Buddhist texts, while also producing original commentaries and interpretations that reflected local understanding of Buddhist teachings. The famous library cave at Dunhuang, sealed in the 11th century and rediscovered in 1900, contained over 40,000 manuscripts and printed documents that provide unprecedented insight into Buddhist intellectual life along the Silk Road. Buddhism's transformation of Chinese culture extended far beyond religious practice to influence art, literature, philosophy, and social organization. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning that preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. Buddhist concepts of compassion and universal salvation influenced Chinese ethical thinking, while Buddhist meditation practices offered new approaches to spiritual cultivation. The religion's emphasis on textual study and scriptural authority reinforced Chinese traditions of literary scholarship, creating synergies that enabled Buddhism to integrate deeply into Chinese intellectual life. The artistic traditions that developed at Buddhist sites along the Silk Road reflected the cosmopolitan nature of these trading communities. Buddhist art in cities like Kizil, Kumtura, and Bezeklik incorporated artistic elements from India, Persia, Central Asia, and China. creating distinctive regional styles that could not have developed in isolation from the cultural exchanges facilitated by long-distance trade. These artistic syntheses demonstrate how Buddhism served as a vehicle for broader cultural integration across the Silk Road network. The decline of Buddhism in Central Asia during the 8th through 10th centuries AD coincided with changing political and economic conditions that disrupted the traditional patterns of Silk Road trade. The rise of Islamic powers in Central Asia created new religious and cultural dynamics, while political instability reduced the security and profitability of long-distance commerce. However, the Buddhist artistic and architectural traditions established during the religion's golden age along the Silk Road continued to influence cultural development across the region for centuries after Buddhism's political decline. Chang'an in the year 750 AD was unlike any city the world had ever seen. With a population approaching 1 million inhabitants, it was the largest urban center on Earth, a metropolis that made contemporary Constantinople seem provincial and Baghdad appear modest. The city's walls enclosed an area of over 30 square miles, containing palaces, temples, markets, and residential districts organized according to a grid plan of mathematical precision. But Chang'an's true significance lay not in its size, but in its extraordinary diversity, a cosmopolitan character that reflected the Tang dynasty's position at the center of the world's most extensive trade networks. Walking through Chang'an's streets, a visitor would encounter merchants speaking dozens of languages, wearing costumes from across the known world, and worshipping in temples dedicated to faiths that most Chinese had never imagined. Persian Zoroastrians maintained fire temples where sacred flames burned continuously. Nestorian Christians celebrated liturgies in Syriac, their churches featuring crosses alongside Chinese architectural elements. Manichaeans, followers of a Persian prophet who had synthesized elements of Christianity, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism, operated temples that attracted both foreign residents and curious Chinese converts. Buddhist monasteries representing various schools and traditions competed for imperial patronage and popular devotion. The Western Market, Chang'an's primary commercial district for international trade, occupied over 1,600 acres and contained more than 3,000 shops organized into specialized sections for different categories of goods. The market's international character was immediately apparent to visitors who encountered merchants selling products from across the known world. Persian carpets, Indian spices, Central Asian horses, and Byzantine goldwork competed for space with Chinese silk, porcelain, and lacquerware in a commercial environment unlike anything previously seen in human history. Foreign merchants in Chang'an established permanent communities with their own temples, schools, and social organizations that maintained cultural connections to their homelands while adapting to Chinese urban life. The Sogdian merchant community, numbering several thousand individuals, constructed elaborate mansions in the city's western districts and commissioned Chinese artisans to create hybrid architectural styles that combined Central Asian and Chinese design elements. These residences featured traditional Chinese courtyard layouts with Persian-influenced decorative motifs and Central Asian furniture arrangements. The Tang government's policies toward foreign merchants reflected a sophisticated understanding of international commerce that balanced revenue generation with the need to maintain attractive conditions for long-distance traders. Imperial officials established standardized taxation rates for imported goods that were high enough to generate substantial government revenue, but not so excessive as to discourage trade. The government also provided security services, maintained commercial infrastructure, and offered legal protections that made Chang'an an attractive destination for merchants from across Eurasia. Tang customs officials developed detailed classification systems for imported goods that enabled precise taxation while preventing disputes over commodity categories and valuations. These systems required extensive knowledge of foreign products and manufacturing techniques, leading to the creation of specialized bureaucratic positions for officials with international commercial expertise. The government maintained reference collections of foreign goods that customs officials could use to verify the authenticity and quality of imported merchandise. The establishment of the Tang dynasty in 618 AD had marked the beginning of the most prosperous and culturally dynamic period in Silk Road history. Unlike their predecessors, the Tang emperors pursued an aggressive expansionist policy that extended Chinese control deep into Central Asia, creating the largest empire in Chinese history and establishing direct administrative control over vast stretches of the trade routes that had previously operated under loose diplomatic arrangements. Emperor Taizong's military campaigns during the 632nd and 642nd AD systematically conquered the Tarim Basin kingdoms that had maintained semi-independent status for centuries. The conquest of Gaochang in 640 AD eliminated the last major independent power in the eastern Tarim Basin, while subsequent campaigns against Kucha, Kashgar, and other oasis cities brought the entire region under direct Chinese administration. These conquests differed from earlier Chinese involvement in Central Asia, which had relied primarily on tributary relationships and diplomatic alliances rather than direct territorial control. The Tang Protectorate system, known as the Protectorate General to pacify the West, established Chinese military garrisons and administrative centers throughout Central Asia. The Protectorate headquarters at Kucha controlled a network of fortified positions extending from Dunhuang in the east to Samarkand in the west, with subsidiary commands at Kashgar, Khotan, and Karashar. Each garrison maintained several hundred Chinese soldiers supported by local auxiliary troops, creating a military presence capable of protecting trade routes and enforcing imperial policies across thousands of miles of territory. Chinese military engineers constructed an extensive network of beacon towers and fortified way stations that provided communication and logistical support for the Protectorate forces. These installations, spaced at regular intervals along major trade routes, enabled rapid transmission of military intelligence and administrative orders across the vast distances of Central Asia. The beacon tower system could relay urgent messages from Kashgar to Chang'an in less than 10 days, a remarkable achievement given the geographical obstacles involved. The diversification of trade goods during the Tang period transformed the character of Silk Road commerce from its earlier focus on luxury items for elite consumers. While silk remained an important export product, Chinese merchants began shipping porcelain, tea, paper, and various manufactured goods that appealed to broader market segments in foreign countries. This diversification reflected both increased production capacity in China and growing demand for Chinese products among middle-class consumers in Central Asian and Middle Eastern markets. Chinese porcelain production expanded dramatically during the Tang period as potters developed new techniques for creating high-quality ceramics that could survive the rigors of long-distance transportation. Tang porcelain featured distinctive glazes and decorative styles that appealed to foreign consumers while maintaining the technical superiority that distinguished Chinese ceramics from products manufactured in other regions. The development of specialized packing techniques using straw, silk padding, and wooden containers enabled porcelain to reach distant markets without significant breakage. Tea cultivation and processing emerged as major Chinese export industries during the Tang period, introducing this beverage to Central Asian and Middle Eastern populations who had previously been unfamiliar with tea consumption. Chinese merchants discovered that tea's lightweight and high value made it ideal for long-distance trade, while its preservation qualities enabled it to maintain quality during extended transportation periods. The development of compressed tea bricks specifically for export markets created standardized products that could be easily transported and traded. Incoming trade goods reflected the unprecedented geographical scope of Tang commercial networks. Arabian horses, prized for their speed and endurance, arrived in Chang'an through Central Asian intermediaries who had developed specialized knowledge of equine breeding and training. These horses commanded enormous prices in Chinese markets, where military officials and wealthy civilians competed to acquire animals with superior bloodlines and proven performance capabilities. Precious stones from various regions created new categories of luxury goods in Chinese markets. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, rubies from Burma, and pearls from the Persian Gulf reached Chang'an through complex trading networks that involved multiple intermediaries and transportation methods. Chinese artisans developed new jewelry-making techniques specifically designed to showcase these foreign gemstones, creating hybrid artistic styles that combined traditional Chinese metalwork with international decorative elements. The cultural flowering that occurred along the Silk Road during the Tang period reflected the unprecedented level of international interaction facilitated by political stability and economic prosperity. Chinese poets, musicians, and artists absorbed influences from Central Asian traditions while contributing their own innovations to the cosmopolitan culture that developed in major trading cities. This cultural synthesis produced artistic achievements that could not have emerged in isolation from the international exchanges enabled by long-distance trade. Tang poetry reached its greatest heights during this period, with poets like Li Bai and Du Fu creating works that incorporated imagery and themes derived from their exposure to foreign cultures and landscapes. Li Bai's poems frequently referenced Central Asian geography, foreign customs, and international travel experiences that reflected the cosmopolitan environment of Tang society. His famous poem, The Road to Shu, drew upon his knowledge of the dangerous mountain routes that connected China with Central Asian territories, creating literary works that captured the adventurous spirit of the Silk Road era. Musical exchanges between Chinese and Central Asian traditions produced new instrumental techniques and compositional styles that influenced court entertainment and popular culture. The pipa, a stringed instrument derived from Central Asian prototypes, became central to Tang court music, while undergoing modifications that adapted it to Chinese musical preferences. Chinese musicians learned Central Asian playing techniques while developing new musical forms that combine Chinese melodic structures with foreign rhythmic patterns. Dance traditions from various Central Asian cultures merged with Chinese performance styles to create new forms of entertainment that became popular in both court and commercial contexts. The Western region dance, performed in Tang palaces, incorporated movements, costumes, and musical accompaniment derived from Sogdian, Persian, and Turkish traditions while maintaining Chinese aesthetic principles. These performances required extensive cultural knowledge and artistic skill, creating new categories of professional entertainers who specialized in international performance styles. The Tang imperial court's patronage of international artists and scholars created an environment that encouraged cultural innovation and artistic experimentation. Foreign musicians, painters, and craftsmen received imperial commissions that provided them with resources and status, while exposing Chinese audiences to artistic traditions from across Eurasia. The court maintained workshops where Chinese and foreign artisans collaborated on projects that combined different technical traditions and aesthetic approaches. The Golden Age of Tang Chang'an represented the highest achievement of Silk Road civilization, a moment when the accumulated wealth and cultural exchange of centuries produced a society of unprecedented sophistication and diversity. The city's decline, when it came, would mark not just the end of Tang power, but the beginning of fundamental changes in global trade patterns that would eventually render the overland Silk Road obsolete. But for a brief, brilliant period, Chang'an stood as proof of what human civilization could achieve when barriers fell and cultures connected across the vast distances that had once seemed insurmountable. The Battle of Talas in 751 AD lasted only 5 days, but its consequences would reshape the world for centuries. On a remote Central Asian battlefield, where the Talas River flows through what is now Kazakhstan, Chinese and Arab armies clashed for control of territories that had been contested for generations. The Tang forces, weakened by the defection of their Karluk Turkish allies, suffered a devastating defeat. Thousands of Chinese soldiers were killed or captured, and Tang authority in western Central Asia collapsed almost overnight. Among the prisoners taken by the victorious Arab forces were Chinese craftsmen whose knowledge would prove more valuable than any military conquest. These artisans, skilled in the closely guarded techniques of paper manufacturing, were transported to Samarkand, where they established workshops that would transform the intellectual and administrative capabilities of the Islamic world. Within decades, paper production had spread from Samarkand to Baghdad, Damascus, and eventually throughout the Islamic territories, enabling a revolution in record-keeping, scholarship, and communication that would define the medieval Islamic Golden Age. The Arab conquest of Central Asia had begun decades before Talas, with the capture of Bukhara in 709 AD marking the first major Islamic advance into territories that had been dominated by various Turkic and Iranian peoples. The Umayyad and subsequent Abbasid administrations approached Central Asian governance with pragmatic flexibility that differed markedly from earlier Chinese administrative methods. Rather than imposing uniform Islamic law across diverse populations, Arab administrators developed accommodating policies that permitted local customs to continue alongside Islamic practices, provided they did not directly contradict fundamental Islamic principles. The conversion process in Central Asian territories proceeded gradually and unevenly, often following commercial and social networks rather than administrative boundaries. Sogdian merchant families, recognizing the advantages of religious affiliation with the new ruling elite, frequently adopted Islam while maintaining their established business relationships and commercial practices. These conversions created hybrid cultural forms that combined Islamic religious observance with traditional Central Asian commercial customs and social arrangements. Samarkand emerged as the preeminent Islamic commercial center in Central Asia during the 9th and 10th centuries, surpassing even Baghdad in certain categories of international trade. The city's strategic position at the convergence of routes from China, India, Persia, and the Middle East made it an ideal location for the complex commercial operations that characterized Islamic period trade. Samarkand's market specialized in high-value goods, requiring sophisticated commercial expertise, including Chinese silk, Indian precious stones, Persian carpets, and various luxury manufactured products from across the Islamic world. The Samanid dynasty, ruling from Bukhara between 875 and 999 AD, created the most successful synthesis of Islamic governance with Central Asian commercial traditions. The Samanids maintained nominal allegiance to the Abbasid Caliphate, while exercising practical independence in managing their territory's economic and commercial affairs. Their policies actively encouraged long-distance trade through infrastructure investment, legal standardization, and diplomatic arrangements that facilitated merchant activities across their extensive territories. Samanid silver mines in the Panjshir Valley and other locations provided the monetary foundation for expanded commercial activities throughout Central Asia and beyond. The consistent quality and weight of Samanid silver dirhams made them the preferred currency for international transactions across a vast geographical area, extending from the Baltic Sea to the Indian Ocean. Archaeological evidence reveals Samanid coins in Scandinavian hoards, indicating the remarkable geographical scope of trade networks that utilize Samanid silver as a medium of exchange. The standardization of Islamic commercial law across Central Asian territories eliminated many of the legal complexities that had previously complicated international trade relationships. Islamic legal scholars developed comprehensive frameworks for handling commercial disputes, contractual arrangements, and partnership agreements that could be applied consistently across different regions and cultural contexts. The concept of the Ummah, or community of believers, created legal presumptions of trustworthiness and shared obligations that facilitated business relationships between merchants who had never met personally. The development of the Hawala system during this period revolutionized long-distance commercial finance by enabling merchants to transfer funds across vast distances without physically transporting precious metals or coins. This system relied on networks of trusted agents who maintained detailed records of financial obligations and periodically settled accounts through various compensation mechanisms. A merchant in Bukhara could deposit silver with a local Hawala agent and authorize a colleague in Damascus to collect equivalent value from the agent's correspondent, eliminating the risks and costs associated with transporting currency across dangerous territories. Hawala operations required extensive communication networks and sophisticated record-keeping systems that connected commercial communities across the Islamic world. The system's effectiveness depended on the reliability of participating agents and the accuracy of exchange rate information transmitted between different commercial centers. Islamic merchants developed standardized procedures for calculating exchange rates, accounting for transportation costs, and managing the timing differences involved in long-distance financial transactions. Bukhara's rise as a major intellectual center complemented its commercial importance, creating a unique environment where Islamic scholarship flourished alongside international trade activities. The city's madrasas attracted students from across the Islamic world, while its libraries preserved and transmitted classical texts from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources. The famous physician and philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, spent his formative years in Bukhara, where he had access to an extraordinary collection of philosophical and scientific manuscripts that shaped his intellectual development. The translation movement that characterized Islamic intellectual life during the 9th and 10th centuries relied heavily on the cosmopolitan commercial networks that connected Islamic territories with other cultural regions. Merchants traveling to India, China, and Byzantine territories frequently carried manuscripts and books that they sold to Islamic scholars and libraries. This commercial trade in intellectual materials enabled Islamic scholars to access Greek philosophical texts, Indian mathematical treatises, and Chinese scientific works that would have been otherwise unavailable. Islamic scholars working in Central Asian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara developed sophisticated techniques for translating and preserving classical knowledge from various cultural traditions. the House of Wisdom in Baghdad served as the most famous center for this activity, but similar institutions in Central Asian cities played equally important roles in preserving and transmitting classical learning. These scholarly activities often received financial support from wealthy merchants who recognized the practical value of scientific and mathematical knowledge for their commercial operations. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge from Indian sources reached Islamic scholars primarily through commercial networks that connected Central Asian cities with Indian trading centers. Islamic mathematicians learned Indian numerical systems and computational techniques that they refined and transmitted throughout the Islamic world. The adoption of Indian numerical notation, including the concept of zero, revolutionized mathematical calculation and enabled the development of more sophisticated commercial accounting systems. The preservation of Greek philosophical texts through Arabic translations proved crucial for the eventual transmission of classical knowledge to medieval Europe. Islamic scholars not only translated Greek works, but also wrote extensive commentaries that clarified difficult concepts and connected Greek philosophical ideas with Islamic theological principles. These commentaries often incorporated insights from Persian and Indian philosophical traditions that Islamic scholars had encountered through commercial and cultural exchanges along the Silk Road. The development of Islamic commercial partnerships, known as mudaraba arrangements, enabled merchants to pool resources and share risks in ways that facilitated larger and more ambitious trading ventures. These partnerships typically involved one party providing capital while another contributed labor and expertise, with profits shared according to predetermined formulas. The legal framework governing mudaraba relationships provided security for investors while enabling entrepreneurial merchants to access capital for trading activities. Islamic commercial law's emphasis on ethical business practices and fair dealing created trust relationships that facilitated long-distance trade, even between merchants who belonged to different ethnic or cultural groups. The Islamic prohibition on usury led to the development of alternative financing mechanisms that achieved similar economic functions without violating religious principles. These innovations in commercial finance enabled Islamic merchants to compete effectively with non-Islamic trading networks while maintaining religious compliance. The expansion of Islamic influence along the Silk Road coincided with significant technological innovations in transportation and logistics. Islamic merchants developed improved caravan organization techniques that increased the efficiency and safety of long-distance travel. These improvements included better methods for loading and securing cargo, more effective systems for managing pack animals, and enhanced security arrangements that reduced losses from banditry and natural hazards. The construction of caravanserais at regular intervals along major trade routes provided standardized accommodation and services for traveling merchants. These facilities, typically built around fortified courtyards with secure storage areas and animal pens, offered protection from both weather and human threats. The caravanserais also served as information centers where merchants could obtain current intelligence about market conditions, route safety, and political developments in distant regions. The Islamic transformation of Central Asia created new patterns of commerce and culture that would endure for centuries. The synthesis of Islamic religious principles with Central Asian commercial traditions produced a distinctive civilization that combined spiritual devotion with worldly prosperity. The merchants, scholars, and administrators who created this civilization understood that trade and faith could reinforce each other, that commercial success could serve religious purposes, and that the pursuit of knowledge was both a spiritual obligation and a practical necessity. In the spring of 1219, the Khwarezmian governor of Otrar made a decision that would cost millions of lives and reshape the political geography of Eurasia. A Mongol trade caravan, carrying goods worth a fortune and bearing diplomatic credentials from Genghis Khan himself, arrived at the city seeking permission to conduct commerce. The governor, suspecting the merchants were spies, ordered them arrested and executed, their goods confiscated for his personal treasury. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to demand explanation and compensation, the Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II had them killed as well. The Mongol response was annihilation. Genghis Khan mobilized the largest army he had ever assembled, perhaps 200,000 warriors, and launched a campaign of systematic destruction that would eliminate the Khwarezmian Empire from existence. Cities that resisted were razed to the ground, their populations massacred without regard for age or gender. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Nishapur, urban centers that had flourished for centuries, were reduced to smoking ruins. Contemporary chroniclers described pyramids of skulls, irrigation systems deliberately destroyed, agricultural lands rendered uninhabitable for generations. The destruction was not mindless rage but calculated terror, a demonstration of the consequences awaiting anyone who defied Mongol authority. Genghis Khan understood that his relatively small nomadic population could never garrison the vast territories he sought to control. Fear would have to substitute for occupation, and the Khwarezmian campaign provided examples that would discourage resistance throughout the Mongol conquests. Cities that surrendered without resistance were generally spared. Those that fought faced extermination. Yet from this apocalyptic violence emerged something unexpected: the most extensive period of peace and commercial prosperity the Silk Road had ever known. The Pax Mongolica, extending roughly from 1260 to 1350 AD, created conditions for cultural exchange and technological transmission that exceeded anything achieved during the Tang Golden Age. The political stability and commercial security provided by unified Mongol administration enabled scholars, artisans, and religious teachers to travel safely across vast distances, carrying ideas and techniques that would have remained isolated within their regions of origin under previous political conditions. Genghis Khan's legal innovations, codified in the Yasa, established uniform standards for commercial transactions, criminal justice, and administrative procedures across the vast expanse of Mongol territories. The Yasa's provisions regarding merchant protection, contract enforcement, and dispute resolution created legal frameworks that facilitated long-distance trade by reducing uncertainties and risks that had previously complicated international commercial relationships. Merchants operating under Mongol protection could rely on consistent legal treatment regardless of their ethnic background or the specific territories through which they traveled. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, represented the most sophisticated communication network in medieval history, enabling rapid transmission of information across distances that had previously required months or years for message delivery. The system operated through a network of relay stations, positioned at intervals of approximately 25 miles along major routes, each station maintaining fresh horses and riders capable of carrying imperial messages at unprecedented speeds. A message from Karakoram could reach European territories in 6 weeks, while communications to Chinese territories required only 3 weeks. Yam stations provided not only communication services, but also accommodation and logistical support for authorized travelers, including merchants carrying imperial trading permits. These facilities offered secure lodging, fresh pack animals, and route information that significantly reduced the costs and risks associated with long-distance travel. The standardization of services across the entire Yam network created predictable travel conditions that enabled merchants to plan complex trading expeditions with greater confidence in their ability to complete planned itineraries. Mongol trade policies actively encouraged long-distance commerce through tax reductions, infrastructure investments, and diplomatic arrangements that eliminated many of the obstacles that had previously complicated international trade. The Mongols reduced or eliminated customs duties on goods transiting their territories, recognizing that increased trade volumes would generate greater total revenue than high taxation rates that discouraged commercial activities. This approach proved remarkably successful in attracting merchants from across Eurasia to utilize Mongol-controlled trade routes. The integration of conquered territories into a unified administrative system required the development of standardized currency and measurement systems that could facilitate commercial transactions across culturally diverse regions. Mongol administrators adopted silver as the primary medium of exchange for high-value transactions, while permitting local currencies to continue circulating for smaller commercial activities. This dual currency system provided flexibility for different types of commercial transactions, while establishing imperial control over major financial flows. Marco Polo's journey to China between 1271 and 1295 AD occurred during the height of Mongol power, when the political stability and commercial infrastructure created by Mongol administration made such extended travel both possible and profitable. Polo's family belonged to a network of Venetian merchants who had recognized the commercial opportunities created by Mongol unification of Eurasian trade routes. Their success in establishing trading relationships with Mongol authorities demonstrated the practical benefits of the Pax Mongolica for European commercial expansion. The detailed observations recorded in Marco Polo's account provide invaluable documentation of commercial conditions, urban development, and cultural practices throughout the Mongol Empire during the late 13th century. His descriptions of Chinese cities, manufacturing techniques, and commercial practices introduced European audiences to economic possibilities that would influence European exploration and trade policies for centuries. Polo's account of paper money usage in China particularly impressed European readers who had never encountered government-issued currency, not backed by precious metals. Chinese technological knowledge reached Middle Eastern and European territories during this period through systematic Mongol policies that relocated skilled craftsmen and scholars to regions where their expertise could contribute to imperial objectives. Chinese engineers working on Middle Eastern irrigation projects introduced new techniques for water management and agricultural development, while Chinese medical practitioners shared knowledge of surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations that enhanced medical capabilities in Islamic territories. The westward transmission of gunpowder technology during the Mongol period revolutionized military capabilities across Eurasia, though the full implications of this technological transfer would not become apparent until the 14th and 15th centuries. Mongol armies utilized Chinese explosive devices and early firearms in their European campaigns, introducing these technologies to regions that quickly recognized their military potential and began developing their own weapons production capabilities. Islamic astronomical and mathematical knowledge traveled eastward through Mongol networks, reaching Chinese scholars who incorporated Islamic computational techniques and observational methods into their own scientific traditions. The Yuan dynasty's astronomical bureau employed Islamic astronomers who brought sophisticated mathematical tools and theoretical frameworks that enhanced Chinese astronomical capabilities. These exchanges created hybrid scientific traditions that combined the best elements of different cultural approaches to understanding natural phenomena. The establishment of Mongol capitals at Karakoram and later Khanbalik created new centers for international commerce that attracted merchants from across the known world. These cities featured markets where goods from Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, China, and India could be found in close proximity, creating commercial opportunities that had never previously existed. The cosmopolitan character of these Mongol capitals facilitated cultural exchanges and business relationships that transcended traditional ethnic and religious boundaries. The Mongol Empire's religious tolerance policies created conditions that facilitated the spread of various religious traditions across Eurasia. Nestorian Christianity reached China in unprecedented numbers during the Mongol period, while Islamic scholars and religious teachers gained access to Chinese territories that had previously been largely closed to foreign religious influences. Buddhist monasteries in Central Asian territories received protection and support from Mongol administrators, enabling them to maintain their educational and cultural functions despite the political upheavals of the conquest period. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into separate khanates during the late 13th and early 14th centuries initially disrupted some of the unified administrative systems that had facilitated long-distance trade, but the individual khanates generally maintained policies that supported commercial activities within their respective territories. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia each developed administrative systems that preserved many of the commercial advantages created by unified Mongol rule, while adapting to local conditions and requirements. The Pax Mongolica demonstrated that political unity across vast territories could create economic benefits that exceeded the costs of conquest and administration. The Mongol achievement, built on unprecedented violence, produced unprecedented prosperity. The contradiction was not lost on contemporary observers, who struggled to reconcile the horror of Mongol conquests with the benefits of Mongol peace. The Silk Road had never been safer, never more profitable, never more culturally productive than during the century when Mongol power was at its height. In the autumn of 1346, Mongol forces besieging the Genoese trading post of Kaffa on the Crimean coast employed a weapon more terrible than any in their arsenal. The Mongol army had been devastated by a mysterious plague that killed victims within days, covering their bodies with black swellings that oozed blood and pus. Unable to continue the siege with their depleted forces, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls before withdrawing. The Genoese defenders, already weakened by the disease spreading within their walls, abandoned Kaffa and fled by ship to Constantinople, Messina, and Genoa, carrying the plague with them. Within 5 years, the Black Death had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. The pandemic spread along the same trade routes that had carried silk, spices, and ideas across Eurasia for centuries, transforming the pathways of prosperity into corridors of death. The Silk Road, which had connected civilizations and enabled unprecedented cultural exchange, now demonstrated its capacity to transmit catastrophe with equal efficiency. The plague's origins lay in the rodent populations of Central Asia, where the bacterium Yersinia pestis had circulated among marmots and other burrowing animals for millennia. Climate changes during the early 14th century, possibly triggered by volcanic eruptions or solar variations, disrupted the ecological balance that had kept the disease confined to its animal hosts. Infected fleas, seeking new hosts as their rodent populations declined, began biting humans with increasing frequency. The first human outbreaks occurred in the 1330s, spreading through Central Asian trading cities before reaching the Mongol armies besieging Kaffa. The demographic collapse in Central Asian trading centers disrupted the intricate networks of commercial relationships, specialized knowledge, and financial arrangements that had sustained long-distance overland trade. Merchant families who had maintained trading partnerships across multiple generations found their operations crippled by the loss of experienced traders local contacts, and the specialized linguistic and cultural knowledge necessary for navigating complex international transactions. The Hawala banking system, which had depended on personal relationships and reputation networks spanning thousands of miles, collapsed in many regions as key participants succumbed to disease or fled to safer territories. Surviving merchants discovered that the infrastructure supporting overland trade had deteriorated dramatically during the plague years. Caravanserais that had provided essential services for traveling merchants stood empty or had been converted to other purposes, while the specialized craftsmen who had maintained pack animals, repaired equipment, and provided route guidance had either died or abandoned their trades. The knowledge of seasonal travel conditions, water sources, and safe passage routes that had been accumulated over centuries of commercial experience was lost as experienced guides and caravan leaders perished without passing their expertise to successors. The political fragmentation that followed the collapse of unified Mongol administration created additional obstacles for merchants attempting to rebuild overland trading networks. The Yuan dynasty's fall in 1368 AD and replacement by the Ming dynasty marked the end of the cosmopolitan, trade-friendly policies that had characterized Mongol rule in China. The new Ming administration, led by Emperor Hongwu, implemented isolationist policies that severely restricted foreign merchant access to Chinese territories and eliminated many of the legal protections and commercial privileges that had attracted international traders to Chinese markets. Ming officials viewed foreign merchants with suspicion, considering them potential security threats who might provide intelligence to hostile powers or introduce destabilizing foreign influences into Chinese society. The tributary system that replaced open commercial relationships required foreign traders to obtain official permits, submit to extensive bureaucratic procedures, and conduct business only through government-approved channels. These restrictions dramatically increased the costs and uncertainties associated with trading with China, making overland routes less attractive compared to emerging maritime alternatives. The Chagatai Khanate's fragmentation into competing successor states created a patchwork of conflicting authorities along Central Asian trade routes, each imposing its own taxation systems, legal requirements, and security arrangements. Merchants traveling from China to Middle Eastern markets now faced multiple border crossings, currency exchanges, and diplomatic negotiations that had been unnecessary during the period of unified Mongol administration. The absence of standardized commercial law meant that contractual disputes could not be resolved through consistent legal procedures, while the lack of coordinated security arrangements left merchant caravans vulnerable to banditry and local conflicts. Timur's campaigns during the late 14th century brought temporary political unification to much of Central Asia, but his military methods caused additional damage to the urban centers and agricultural systems that supported trade route operations. While Timur's court at Samarkand became a center for artistic and intellectual activity, his frequent military campaigns disrupted commercial activities throughout the region. The enormous resources devoted to military operations reduced the capital available for commercial investment, while the constant threat of warfare made long-term business planning extremely difficult. The year 1498 marked the moment when the ancient world truly died. When Vasco da Gama's battered ships dropped anchor in the harbor of Calicut, he did not merely discover a new route to India. He drove a stake through the heart of a trading system that had sustained civilizations for 2,000 years. The Portuguese captain, standing on the deck of his carrack with the monsoon winds filling his sails, could not have known that he was witnessing the funeral of the Silk Road. But the merchants of Samarkand knew. The caravaneers of Kashgar knew. The innkeepers of 1,000 caravanserais stretching from the Mediterranean to the Pacific knew. They felt it in their bones before they understood it in their minds. The world was shifting beneath their feet, and nothing would ever be the same again. The maritime revolution did not happen overnight. It was the culmination of centuries of European frustration, technological innovation, and desperate ambition. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had been a psychological shock to Christendom, but its economic impact was often exaggerated by later historians seeking simple explanations for complex phenomena. The Ottoman Turks, far from closing the eastern trade routes, were eager participants in the lucrative commerce that flowed through their territories. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, understood that trade meant taxes, and taxes meant power. He welcomed Venetian and Genoese merchants to his domains, granted them trading privileges, and watched the customs revenues pour into his treasury. But the Italians had grown complacent. For centuries, Venice and Genoa had maintained a stranglehold on the eastern trade, acting as middlemen between Asia and Europe, extracting profits at every stage of the journey. They had no incentive to seek new routes when the old ones served them so well. It was the nations on the Atlantic fringe of Europe, Portugal and Spain, that felt the hunger most acutely. Excluded from the Mediterranean trade by Italian dominance and Ottoman power, they looked westward and southward for alternatives. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal never actually navigated anywhere himself, but his vision transformed the world. From his headquarters at Sagres on the wind-swept southwestern tip of Europe, he sponsored expedition after expedition down the African coast. His captains pushed further south each year, mapping unknown coastlines, establishing trading posts, and searching for a route around Africa to the riches of the East. Henry died in 1460, decades before his dream was realized, but the momentum he created proved unstoppable. Portuguese ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, and 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey to India. The impact on the overland trade routes was not immediate but inexorable. Sea transport offered advantages that no caravan could match. A single Portuguese carrack could carry more cargo than 100 camels. The journey from Lisbon to Goa took months rather than years. There were no bandits on the open ocean, no corrupt officials demanding bribes, no mountain passes blocked by snow, no deserts where men and animals died of thirst. The risks were different. Storms, shipwrecks, scurvy, pirates. But they were risks that could be managed with better ships, better navigation, and bigger guns. The Portuguese did not simply trade, they conquered. They seized Goa in 1510, Malacca in 1511, Ormuz in 1515. They established a network of fortified trading posts, stretching from Mozambique to Macau, controlling the choke points of maritime commerce with cannon and cavalry. The Estado da India, as they called their eastern empire, was never large in terms of territory or population, but it dominated the sea lanes that mattered. Any ship carrying spices, silk, or other valuable goods had to either submit to Portuguese authority or risk destruction. The merchants of the Silk Road found themselves increasingly marginalized. The great caravanserais that had once bustled with activity began to fall silent. The oasis cities that had grown rich on transit trade watched their revenues decline year by year. Samarkand, which had been the jewel of Central Asia under Timur, became a provincial backwater. Kashgar, the gateway between China and the West, saw its markets shrink and its population dwindle. The camel caravans still crossed the deserts and mountains, but they carried a fraction of the goods they once had, and the profits were meager compared to the glory days. The human cost of this transformation was immense but largely invisible to the Europeans who caused it. Entire communities that had sustained themselves for generations through the caravan trade found their livelihoods destroyed. The camel breeders of Arabia, the muleteers of Persia, the porters of the Pamir passes, the guides who knew every water source in the Taklamakan. All of these people saw their skills become worthless, their knowledge obsolete. Some adapted, finding new occupations in the changed economy. Others simply disappeared, their descendants scattered and assimilated, their stories lost to history. The Silk Road did not die completely, of course. Overland trade continued, albeit at reduced volumes, well into the modern era. Certain goods, jade, horses, furs, still moved along the ancient routes because they were too bulky or too fragile for sea transport. Local and regional trade persisted even as long-distance commerce declined. The caravanserais continued to serve travelers, even if those travelers were fewer and poorer than before. But the great age of the Silk Road, the era when it served as the primary artery of global commerce, was over. The future belonged to the ships. The Portuguese monopoly did not last long. The Spanish, the Dutch, the English, and the French all wanted their share of the Eastern trade, and they were willing to fight for it. The 16th and 17th centuries saw a series of brutal wars for control of the maritime routes. Wars that were fought not just in European waters but in the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Pacific. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became the most powerful commercial organization the world had ever seen, with its own army, its own navy, and the authority to make war and peace in the name of profit. The English East India Company, established 2 years earlier, would eventually surpass it, laying the foundations for the British Empire in India. These European trading companies brought a new kind of commerce to Asia, commerce backed by overwhelming military force. The old Silk Road had been a network of voluntary exchange, where merchants from different cultures met as equals, negotiating prices and terms in a spirit of mutual benefit. The maritime trade that replaced it was fundamentally coercive. European ships carried not just goods, but guns, and they were prepared to use them against anyone who resisted their demands. The trading posts they established were fortresses, designed as much for war as for commerce. The treaties they signed with local rulers were often imposed at gunpoint, granting Europeans privileges that no Asian merchant would ever enjoy in European ports. The transformation of global trade patterns had profound effects on the regions that had once prospered from the Silk Road. Central Asia, which had been at the crossroads of civilizations, became a backwater, isolated from the main currents of world commerce. The great cities of the steppe, Bukhara, Samarkand, Khiva, stagnated and declined, their populations shrinking, their monuments crumbling, their scholars and artists departing for more prosperous lands. The nomadic peoples who had once controlled the trade routes found themselves squeezed between expanding empires, the Russians from the north, the Chinese from the east, the Persians and Ottomans from the south and west. Their independence, which had lasted for millennia, was gradually extinguished. Persia, which had been a major beneficiary of the Silk Road trade, struggled to adapt to the new realities. The Safavid dynasty, which ruled Iran from 1501 to 1736, attempted to develop alternative trade routes and to attract European merchants to their domains. Shah Abbas I, the greatest of the Safavid rulers, built a magnificent new capital at Isfahan and encouraged Armenian Christians to settle there as intermediaries in the silk trade. But Persia's geographical position, which had once been an advantage, now became a liability. The country was too far from the sea lanes that mattered, too difficult to reach by ship, too easy to bypass. The Ottoman Empire faced similar challenges. The Turks had built their power on control of the land routes between Asia and Europe, extracting customs duties from the caravans that passed through their territories. The maritime revolution threatened to make those routes irrelevant. The Ottomans responded by attempting to compete at sea, building fleets and establishing naval bases in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. But they were fighting against geography and technology. The Portuguese, and later the Dutch and English, had better ships, better guns, and better seamanship. The Ottoman navy was repeatedly defeated, and Turkish attempts to control the Indian Ocean trade ended in failure. China, the ultimate source of so many Silk Road goods, responded to the maritime revolution with a policy of deliberate isolation. The Ming dynasty, which had sponsored the great voyages of Zheng He in the early 15th century, reversed course and banned private overseas trade. The reasons for this decision were complex, a combination of Confucian ideology, bureaucratic politics, and genuine security concerns about Japanese pirates and other maritime threats. But the effect was to cede control of China's foreign trade to European merchants, who were happy to fill the vacuum. The Portuguese established themselves at Macau in 1557, creating a permanent European foothold on Chinese soil that would last for more than 4 centuries. The maritime revolution also transformed the nature of the goods that flowed between East and West. The Silk Road had been named for its most famous commodity, but silk was only one of many products that traveled along its routes. Spices, gems, precious metals, horses, furs, slaves, and countless other goods had moved in both directions, creating a complex web of exchange that touched every aspect of life. The maritime trade was more focused, more specialized, more driven by European demand for specific Asian products: pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These were the commodities that justified the enormous investments in ships and fortifications, the commodities that made fortunes for merchants and bankrupted kingdoms. The spice trade in particular became an obsession for European powers. Spices were valuable not just for their flavor, but for their preservative properties, their medicinal uses, and their status as luxury goods. A cargo of pepper or cloves could be worth more than its weight in gold, and the profits from a single successful voyage could fund a merchant's retirement. The competition for control of the spice-producing regions, the Moluccas, Ceylon, the Malabar coast, was fierce and often violent. The Dutch, in particular, pursued a policy of ruthless monopoly, destroying spice trees on islands they did not control, massacring populations that resisted their authority, and enforcing their dominance with a brutality that shocked even their European rivals. The human trafficking that had been a dark undercurrent of the Silk Road trade expanded dramatically in the maritime era. The Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English all participated in the slave trade, transporting millions of Africans to the Americas to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities for European markets. Atlantic slave trade was unprecedented in its scale and its horror, dwarfing anything that had existed along the overland routes. It created a triangular commerce linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. A commerce built on human suffering and racial exploitation that would shape the modern world in ways we are still grappling with today. The Silk Road's decline was not just an economic phenomenon, it was a cultural and intellectual transformation as well. For centuries, the overland routes had served as conduits for ideas, religions, technologies, and artistic styles. Buddhism had traveled from India to China along the Silk Road. Islam had spread across Central Asia following the caravan trails. Paper, gunpowder, the compass, and printing had moved from east to west, transforming European civilization. The maritime routes would eventually serve similar functions, but the transition period was marked by a narrowing of cultural exchange, a hardening of boundaries, a growing sense of separation between civilizations that had once been connected. The Europeans who dominated the maritime trade were less interested in cultural exchange than their Silk Road predecessors had been. They came to Asia not to learn but to profit, not to understand but to exploit. They viewed Asian civilizations with a mixture of fascination and contempt, admiring their wealth while despising their religions and customs. The trading posts they established were enclaves of European culture, deliberately separated from the surrounding societies. The missionaries they sent sought not dialogue but conversion, not mutual understanding but the triumph of Christianity over all other faiths. This attitude would have profound consequences in the centuries to come. The maritime powers that replaced the Silk Road traders would eventually become colonial empires, subjugating vast territories and hundreds of millions of people to European rule. The inequality that was built into the maritime trading system, Europeans with guns dictating terms to Asians without them, would become the foundation for a global order based on racial hierarchy and imperial domination. The Silk Road, for all its flaws, had been a network of relative equals. The system that replaced it was fundamentally unequal, and that inequality would poison relations between East and West for generations. But we are getting ahead of our story. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the full implications of the maritime revolution were not yet apparent. The Silk Road was dying, but it was dying slowly, and many of those who depended on it refused to accept that the end was near. The caravans continued to cross the deserts, the merchants continued to haggle in the bazaars, the caravanserais continued to offer shelter to weary travelers. Life went on, even as the foundations of that life were being undermined. It is a pattern we see repeated throughout history, the inability of those living through great transformations to recognize them for what they are, the persistence of old ways even after they have become obsolete, the human capacity for denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. The cities of the Silk Road adapted as best they could to the new realities. Some reinvented themselves as centers of regional trade, serving local markets rather than international commerce. Others became administrative centers for the empires that absorbed them, their economic importance replaced by political significance. A few managed to find new niches in the changed economy, specializing in goods or services that could not easily be provided by sea. But many simply declined, their populations shrinking, their buildings crumbling, their memories fading. The great caravanserais that had once housed hundreds of merchants and thousands of animals became ruins, their courtyards silent, their fountains dry, their walls slowly returning to the earth from which they had been built. The nomadic peoples of Central Asia, who had been both the facilitators and the threats of Silk Road trade, found their world shrinking. The Russian Empire expanded steadily southward and eastward, absorbing the Khanates of the steppe one by one. The Qing dynasty of China pushed westward, conquering Xinjiang and establishing control over territories that had been independent for centuries. The great nomadic confederations that had once terrorized settled civilizations, the Mongols, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, were gradually subdued, their warriors disarmed, their leaders co-opted or eliminated, their way of life transformed beyond recognition. The end of the Silk Road era was not marked by any single event, any dramatic moment that contemporaries recognized as a turning point. It was a gradual process, stretching over centuries, visible only in retrospect. The last caravans did not know they were the last. The final merchants to trade along the ancient routes did not realize they were participating in the conclusion of a 2,000-year story. History rarely provides such neat endings. It simply moves on, leaving behind the ruins of what once was, the memories of what might have been, and the questions of what it all meant. For centuries, the Silk Road existed only in fragments. in the accounts of medieval travelers, in the collections of museums, in the memories of peoples whose ancestors had walked those ancient paths. The great cities that had once flourished along the routes lay buried beneath sand and rubble, their locations forgotten, their treasures hidden from the world. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that European explorers and archaeologists began to uncover the physical remains of this lost civilization, revealing wonders that exceeded even the most extravagant descriptions in the historical sources. The rediscovery of the Silk Road was driven by a combination of imperial ambition, scholarly curiosity, and pure adventure. The Great Game, the strategic rivalry between the British and Russian empires for control of Central Asia, brought European agents into regions that had been closed to outsiders for generations. These agents were often more than spies. They were also scholars, cartographers, and collectors, men who combined their political missions with genuine intellectual interests. They mapped unknown territories, recorded dying languages, and gathered artifacts that would eventually fill the museums of London, St. Petersburg, Berlin, and Paris. The most dramatic discoveries came from the Taklamakan Desert, that fearsome wasteland that had claimed so many lives during the Silk Road's heyday. The extreme aridity of the region had preserved organic materials, paper, silk, wood, leather, that would have rotted away in more hospitable climates. Buried beneath the sand were entire libraries of ancient manuscripts, collections of paintings and sculptures, everyday objects that revealed the intimate details of life along the trade routes. The finds were so rich, so unexpected, so revolutionary in their implications that they transformed our understanding of Asian history. Aurel Stein was the greatest of the Silk Road explorers, a Hungarian-born British archaeologist whose expeditions between 1900 and 1930 uncovered treasures beyond imagination. His first major discovery came at Dandanyulilik, a ruined settlement in the heart of the Taklamakan, where he found Buddhist temples decorated with paintings that blended Indian, Chinese, and Central Asian styles in ways that had never been seen before. The paintings depicted not just religious scenes but everyday life: merchants, musicians, dancers, farmers, providing a window into a vanished world. But Stein's greatest triumph came at the caves of the Thousand Buddhas near Dunhuang, the eastern terminus of the Silk Road's most difficult stretch. In 1907, he learned that a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu had discovered a sealed chamber in one of the caves, a chamber that had been walled up for nearly 1,000 years. Inside were tens of thousands of manuscripts and paintings, the greatest collection of medieval documents ever found. Wang had been using some of the manuscripts to raise money for restoration work on the caves, and Stein, recognizing the significance of the find, persuaded him to part with a large portion of the collection in exchange for a modest donation to his restoration fund. The Dunhuang manuscripts revolutionized the study of Asian history. They included the oldest printed book in the world, a copy of the Diamond Sutra dated to 868 CE, as well as texts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Khotanese, and other languages, some of which were previously unknown to scholars. There were Buddhist sutras and Taoist treatises, Confucian classics and Manichaean hymns, government documents and private letters, medical texts and astronomical charts. The collection revealed the extraordinary diversity of the Silk Road world, the way different cultures and religions had coexisted and interacted in this remote corner of the earth. Stein was not the only explorer drawn to the Silk Road's buried treasures. The German expeditions led by Albert Grunwedel and Albert von Lecoq uncovered spectacular murals at sites like Bezeklik and Kizil, paintings that depicted Buddhist legends with a vividness and sophistication that rivaled anything produced in India or China. The Russian expeditions of Pyotr Kozlov, discovered the dead city of Karakoto, a Tangut settlement abandoned in the 14th century, where the dry desert air had preserved books, paintings, and everyday objects in remarkable condition. The Japanese monk Otani Kozui sponsored expeditions that brought back thousands of artifacts to Japan, while Swedish explorer Sven Hedin mapped vast stretches of previously unknown territory. The competition among these explorers was intense and sometimes bitter. They raced each other to promising sites, jealously guarded their discoveries, and accused their rivals of incompetence or worse. The removal of artifacts to European and Japanese museums was controversial even at the time, and it remains a source of tension today. Chinese scholars, in particular, have long resented what they see as the plundering of their cultural heritage by foreign adventurers. The Dunhuang manuscripts, scattered among institutions in London, Paris, St. Petersburg, and Beijing, have never been reunited, and the question of their rightful ownership remains unresolved. But whatever the ethical complexities of their methods, the early explorers revealed a Silk Road far richer and more complex than anyone had imagined. The artifacts they recovered showed that the trade routes had been not just commercial highways, but cultural crossroads, places where ideas and artistic styles from across Eurasia had met and mingled. The Buddhist art of Central Asia, in particular, demonstrated a creative synthesis that was neither purely Indian nor purely Chinese, but something entirely new. A Silk Road style that drew on multiple traditions while transcending all of them. The archaeological discoveries also revealed the human dimension of the Silk Road in ways that written sources could not. The manuscripts included personal letters from merchants worried about their investments, from soldiers longing for home, from wives anxious about absent husbands. They recorded the prices of goods, the terms of contracts, the details of legal disputes. They preserved the voices of ordinary people, not just kings and generals and famous travelers, but the anonymous masses who had actually made the Silk Road function. These voices, silent for 1,000 years, spoke again through the documents that Stein and his colleagues brought to light. The 20th century brought new methods and new discoveries to Silk Road archaeology. Scientific techniques, radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, satellite imagery, allowed researchers to answer questions that earlier generations could only speculate about. Excavations at sites like Nia, Lulan, and Miran revealed the remains of the people who had lived along the routes, their bodies preserved by the desert's dryness, their faces still recognizable after 2,000 years. The famous beauty of Lulan, a woman who died around 1800 BCE, became an icon of Silk Road archaeology, her serene features and elaborate clothing capturing the imagination of millions. The mummies of the Tarim Basin raised questions that are still being debated today. Many of them had European features, light hair, prominent noses, round eyes, suggesting that the population of this region had been far more diverse than previously assumed. DNA analysis confirmed that these ancient people had genetic connections to populations in Europe and the Middle East, evidence of migrations and mixing that predated the historical Silk Road by millennia. The discovery challenged simplistic notions of racial and cultural purity, demonstrating that Central Asia had been a meeting place of peoples long before the first caravans set out from China. The archaeological resurrection of the Silk Road coincided with and contributed to a broader reassessment of Asian history. For too long, Western scholars had viewed Asia through a Eurocentric lens, treating the continent as a passive recipient of outside influences rather than an active participant in world history. The Silk Road discoveries helped to correct this imbalance, revealing civilizations of extraordinary sophistication and creativity that had flourished independently of European contact. The Buddhist kingdoms of Central Asia, the Tang dynasty of China, the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad. These were not peripheral cultures, but major centers of human achievement, worthy of study on their own terms. The rediscovery also had political implications that extended far beyond the academic world. As the nations of Central Asia gained independence, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, they looked to the Silk Road as a source of historical identity and legitimacy. Uzbekistan claimed Samarkand and Bukhara as symbols of its glorious past. Kazakhstan emphasized its role as a bridge between East and West. Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan all found in the Silk Road heritage a narrative that connected them to world history, that gave meaning and dignity to their existence as independent states. China, too, embraced the Silk Road as a central element of its national story. The trade routes demonstrated that China had never been isolated from the world, that it had always been connected to other civilizations through commerce and cultural exchange. This narrative served contemporary political purposes, providing historical justification for China's engagement with the global economy and its ambitions for regional leadership. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched by President Xi Jinping in 2013, explicitly invoked the Silk Road legacy, promising to recreate the ancient connections through modern infrastructure, railways, highways, ports, and pipelines, linking China to Europe, Africa, and beyond. The tourism industry discovered the Silk Road as well. Travelers who once would have visited only the famous sites of Europe or East Asia began to venture into Central Asia, following in the footsteps of ancient merchants and medieval explorers. They visited the blue-tiled mosques of Samarkand, the mud-brick fortresses of Khiva, the Buddhist caves of Dunhuang, the mountain passes of the Pamirs. They rode camels across the desert, slept in yurts on the steppe, and imagined themselves as participants in the great adventure of transcontinental trade. The Silk Road, which had been forgotten for centuries, became a brand, a marketing concept, a way of packaging history for contemporary consumption. But the archaeological resurrection also raised troubling questions about preservation and authenticity. Many of the sites that attracted tourists were heavily restored, their original features obscured by modern reconstructions. The pressure of visitor numbers threatened to damage fragile remains that had survived for millennia. The commercialization of the Silk Road heritage sometimes reduced complex history to simplistic narratives, emphasizing exotic appeal over scholarly accuracy. The tension between preservation and access, between authenticity and interpretation, between local ownership and global interest, remained unresolved. The manuscripts and artifacts scattered among the world's museums posed their own challenges. Scholars needed access to these materials to advance their research, but the collections were dispersed across multiple institutions, often poorly catalogued, sometimes inaccessible due to political tensions or bureaucratic obstacles. Digital technology offered partial solutions. High-resolution images could be shared online. Databases could be created to track dispersed collections. Virtual reunification could bring together materials that would never be physically assembled. But digital surrogates were not the same as original objects, and the question of where the physical artifacts belonged remained contentious. The archaeological resurrection of the Silk Road was, in many ways, a second life for a phenomenon that had already died once. The trade routes that had connected civilizations for 2,000 years had been killed by the maritime revolution of the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, they were being resurrected, not as functioning commercial highways, but as objects of scholarly study, tourist attraction, and political symbolism. This second Silk Road was different from the first. mediated through museums and academic journals and travel agencies, rather than through caravans and caravanserais. But it kept alive the memory of what had been, and it raised the possibility that what had been might, in some form, come again. The 21st century has witnessed an extraordinary attempt to resurrect the Silk Road, not as a historical curiosity, but as a living reality. The Belt and Road Initiative, announced by Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2013, represents the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history, a plan to connect China to Europe, Africa, and beyond through a network of railways, highways, ports, pipelines, and digital connections. The scale of the undertaking defies easy comprehension. Hundreds of billions of dollars in investment, dozens of countries participating, projects spanning continents and oceans. Whether it will succeed, and what success would mean, remains to be seen. But the very attempt tells us something important about our world and our moment in history. The Belt and Road Initiative, originally called One Belt, One Road before the name was simplified for international audiences, actually comprises two main components. The belt refers to overland routes connecting China to Europe through Central Asia, echoing the ancient Silk Road. The road refers to maritime routes linking Chinese ports to Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean, following the sea lanes that replaced the overland trade in the early modern period. Together they represent a comprehensive vision of Eurasian connectivity, a plan to knit together the world's largest landmass through modern infrastructure. The motivations behind the Belt and Road Initiative are complex and contested. Chinese officials describe it as a win-win proposition, a way of sharing China's development experience with less developed countries while creating new markets for Chinese goods and services. Critics see it as a form of neo-colonialism, a strategy for extending Chinese influence through debt diplomacy and infrastructure dependence. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. The Belt and Road serves multiple purposes simultaneously: economic, political, strategic, and symbolic, and different participants have different reasons for joining. For China, the Belt and Road addresses several pressing challenges. The country's export-oriented economy needs new markets as growth in traditional destinations slows. Its construction and manufacturing industries have excess capacity that domestic demand cannot absorb. Its western provinces, Xinjiang, Tibet, Gansu, Qinghai, remain underdeveloped compared to the coastal regions, and better connections to Central Asia and beyond could stimulate their growth. Its energy security depends on imports from the Middle East and Africa, and diversifying supply routes reduces vulnerability to disruption. Its global ambitions require a network of friendly countries and strategic assets that can project Chinese influence far beyond its borders. For the countries along the Belt and Road, the initiative offers something they desperately need: infrastructure. Decades of underinvestment have left many developing countries with inadequate roads, railways, ports, and power plants, bottlenecks that constrain economic growth and perpetuate poverty. The World Bank estimates that developing countries need to invest $1.5 trillion per year in infrastructure just to maintain current growth rates, far more than they can finance from domestic resources or traditional aid. China offers an alternative: loans and investments on terms that, while not always favorable, are at least available. For countries that have been ignored by Western investors and international institutions, Chinese money is better than no money at all. The projects undertaken under the Belt and Road banner are staggeringly diverse. In Pakistan, Chinese companies are building the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a $62 billion network of roads, railways, and power plants connecting the Chinese border to the Arabian Sea port of Gwadar. In Kazakhstan, a new railway link allows freight trains to travel from China to Europe in 2 weeks, compared to 5 weeks by sea. In Sri Lanka, A Chinese-built port at Hambantota has become a symbol of both the opportunities and the risks of Belt and Road participation. The Sri Lankan government, unable to service its debts, was forced to lease the port to China for 99 years. In Greece, Chinese investment has transformed the port of Piraeus into one of the busiest in the Mediterranean. In Kenya, a Chinese-built railway connects Nairobi to the coast at Mombasa, the first new railway in the country since independence. The Belt and Road has also extended into areas that the ancient Silk Road never reached. Chinese companies are building ports in Latin America, railways in East Africa, power plants in Southeast Asia. The Digital Silk Road aims to connect participating countries through fiber optic cables, data centers, and smart city technologies. The Health Silk Road, announced during the COVID-19 pandemic, promised to share Chinese medical expertise and supplies with countries in need. The Green Silk Road pledges to make Belt and Road projects environmentally sustainable, though critics note that Chinese-funded coal plants continue to be built across Asia and Africa. The geopolitical implications of the Belt and Road have alarmed China's rivals, particularly the United States. American officials warn that the initiative is a Trojan horse for Chinese influence, a way of creating dependencies that can be exploited for political purposes. They point to cases where countries have struggled to repay Chinese loans, allegedly losing control of strategic assets as a result. They worry about Chinese-built infrastructure being used for military purposes, about surveillance technologies being embedded in digital networks, about the erosion of democratic norms in countries that become too closely aligned with Beijing. The competition between Chinese and American visions of global order has become one of the defining features of 21st century geopolitics. But the Belt and Road is not simply a Chinese project imposed on passive recipients. The countries that participate do so for their own reasons, pursuing their own interests, making their own calculations about costs and benefits. Some have embraced Chinese investment enthusiastically, seeing it as a path to modernization and prosperity. Others have been more cautious, negotiating hard for better terms, diversifying their partnerships, maintaining relationships with multiple powers. A few have rejected Chinese offers entirely, concluding that the risks outweigh the rewards. The Belt and Road is not a monolithic enterprise, but a collection of bilateral relationships, each shaped by local circumstances and local agency. The comparison to the ancient Silk Road is both illuminating and misleading. The original Silk Road was not a planned project, but an organic development, emerging gradually over centuries as merchants, missionaries, and migrants found ways to cross the barriers that separated civilizations. It was decentralized and diverse, with no single power controlling its entire length, no master plan guiding its evolution. The Belt and Road, by contrast, is a deliberate initiative, conceived and promoted by a single state, implemented through government-to-government agreements and state-owned enterprises. It is centralized and coordinated in ways that the ancient routes never were. Yet there are genuine continuities as well. The Belt and Road follows many of the same geographical corridors as the ancient Silk Road, passing through the same mountain ranges and river valleys, connecting the same regions and peoples. It faces many of the same challenges: political instability, ethnic conflict, environmental hazards, the sheer difficulty of building and maintaining infrastructure across vast distances. It promises many of the same benefits: increased trade, cultural exchange, economic development, the breaking down of barriers between isolated communities. Whether it will deliver on those promises remains to be seen. The environmental implications of the Belt and Road are particularly concerning. The ancient Silk Road had minimal environmental impact. Camel caravans left few traces, and the trade volumes were tiny by modern standards. The new Silk Road is different. Railways and highways cut through pristine ecosystems, fragmenting habitats and disrupting wildlife migrations. Ports and industrial zones transform coastlines and wetlands. Power plants, many of them burning coal, add to greenhouse gas emissions at a time when the world desperately needs to reduce them. The promise of a green Silk Road has yet to be matched by reality on the ground. The social and cultural dimensions of the Belt and Road are equally complex. The ancient Silk Road was a conduit for ideas and beliefs as well as goods, spreading religions, technologies, and artistic styles across continents. The new Silk Road has the potential to play a similar role, connecting peoples who have been separated by geography and politics, creating opportunities for exchange and understanding. But it also carries risks: the homogenization of cultures under the pressure of global commerce, the displacement of traditional communities by development projects, the exploitation of workers in countries with weak labor protections. The human costs of infrastructure development are often invisible to those who benefit from the finished projects. The future of the Belt and Road is uncertain. The initiative has faced setbacks in recent years, projects delayed or canceled, debts renegotiated, participating countries having second thoughts. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted construction schedules and strained the finances of both China and its partners. The global economic slowdown has reduced demand for the goods that would flow along the new trade routes. Geopolitical tensions have made some countries wary of too close an association with Beijing. The initial enthusiasm that greeted the Belt and Road announcement has given way to a more sober assessment of its costs and benefits. But the underlying logic of Eurasian connectivity remains compelling. The landmass that stretches from the Pacific to the Atlantic contains most of the world's population, most of its economic activity, most of its natural resources. Better connections within this space, faster transport, cheaper logistics, easier communication, would benefit hundreds of millions of people. The question is not whether such connections should be built, but how, by whom, and on what terms. The Belt and Road is one answer to that question, but it is not the only possible answer, and its ultimate success or failure will depend on choices that have yet to be made. The dream of reconnection that animates the Belt and Road is, in some ways, a dream of returning to a world that existed before the Maritime Revolution, before the rise of European colonialism, before the artificial divisions of the modern state system fragmented Eurasia into competing blocks. It is a dream of restoring the centrality of the Asian landmass, of reversing the marginalization that Central Asia suffered when the sea routes replaced the overland trade. Whether this dream can be realized in the 21st century, and what form its realization might take, are questions that will shape the future of our world. As we reach the end of our journey along the Silk Road, from its origins in the mists of prehistory to its attempted resurrection in the 21st century, we must ask ourselves what lessons this extraordinary story holds for our own time. The Silk Road was not just a trade route, it was a way of being in the world, a model of human interaction that persisted for 2 millennia and shaped the civilizations we have inherited. Its successes and failures, its glories and tragedies, offer insights that remain relevant today, perhaps more relevant than ever as we grapple with the challenges of an interconnected world. The first and most fundamental lesson of the Silk Road is that connection is the natural state of humanity. Despite the barriers of geography, the highest mountains, the driest deserts, the vastest steppes, people found ways to reach each other, to trade with each other, to learn from each other. The urge to connect is not a modern phenomenon, not a product of technology or globalization, but something deep in human nature. We are a species that moves, that explores, that seeks out the new and the different. The Silk Road was an expression of this fundamental drive, and its persistence across so many centuries, through so many political upheavals and environmental challenges, testifies to its power. But connection is not automatic or inevitable. It requires effort, investment, and above all, trust. The merchants who traveled the Silk Road depended on networks of relationships that took generations to build. Relationships with suppliers and customers, with caravan leaders and innkeepers, with officials and bandits. They developed institutions to manage risk and resolve disputes, from the informal codes of merchant communities to the formal legal systems of empires. They created a culture of commerce that valued honesty and reliability, that punished cheaters and rewarded those who kept their word. Without this infrastructure of trust, the Silk Road could not have functioned. The lesson for our own time is clear. Global trade and communication depend on institutions and norms that we often take for granted. International law, diplomatic protocols, financial systems, technical standards. These institutions are not natural or permanent. They were created by human effort and can be destroyed by human folly. The erosion of trust between nations, the weakening of international institutions, the rise of nationalism and protectionism, all of these threaten the connections that sustain our prosperity and our peace. The Silk Road reminds us that what has been built can be unbuilt, that the networks we depend on are fragile, that maintaining them requires constant attention and care. The second lesson of the Silk Road concerns the relationship between commerce and culture. Trade was never just about goods. It was always also about ideas. The merchants who carried silk and spices also carried religions and philosophies, technologies and artistic styles. The Silk Road was a vector for Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and countless other belief systems. It spread paper and printing, gunpowder and the compass, mathematics and medicine. It created hybrid cultures that blended elements from multiple traditions, producing art and architecture, music and literature that belonged to no single civilization but drew on all of them. This cultural dimension of trade is often overlooked in contemporary discussions of globalization, which tend to focus on economic metrics, GDP growth, trade balances, investment flows. But the movement of ideas may be more important in the long run than the movement of goods. The technologies that transform our lives, the values that shape our societies, the stories that give meaning to our existence, these travel along the same routes as commodities, often carried by the same people. The Silk Road reminds us that economic integration and cultural exchange are inseparable, that opening borders to trade also opens them to influence, that the consequences of connection extend far beyond the marketplace. The third lesson concerns the role of diversity in human flourishing. The Silk Road was remarkable for its heterogeneity, the variety of peoples, languages, religions, and customs that coexisted along its routes. This diversity was not merely tolerated, it was essential to the system's functioning. Different communities brought different skills and knowledge, different products and perspectives. The Sogdians were master traders, the Arabs expert navigators, the Chinese skilled artisans, the Indians profound philosophers. Each contributed something unique, and the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. The oasis cities of the Silk Road were laboratories of coexistence, places where people of different backgrounds lived side by side, worshipped different gods, spoke different languages, yet managed to cooperate in the common enterprise of trade. This was not always easy or peaceful. There were conflicts and persecutions, prejudices and exclusions. But the overall trajectory was toward accommodation rather than confrontation, toward finding ways to work together despite differences. The Silk Road suggests that diversity is not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be cultivated, that the encounter with the other can be enriching rather than threatening, that human creativity flourishes at the boundaries between cultures. The fourth lesson concerns the relationship between states and markets. The Silk Road operated in the spaces between empires, in the interstices of political power. It was facilitated by states, which provided security, built infrastructure, and established legal frameworks, but it was not controlled by them. The merchants who traveled the routes were private actors pursuing private interests, and their success depended on their ability to navigate multiple political systems, to adapt to changing circumstances, to find opportunities where others saw only obstacles. The Silk Road was neither purely state-directed nor purely market-driven, but a complex interaction between public and private, between political authority and commercial initiative. This balance is relevant to contemporary debates about the role of government in the economy. The Belt and Road Initiative represents a state-led approach to development, with Chinese government agencies and state-owned enterprises playing central roles. Critics argue that this approach is inefficient and prone to corruption, that market forces would allocate resources more effectively. Defenders counter that private capital is unwilling to invest in the infrastructure that developing countries need, that only government can mobilize resources on the necessary scale. The Silk Road suggests that both perspectives have merit, that successful development requires a partnership between states and markets, that the question is not whether government should be involved but how. The fifth lesson concerns the environmental limits of human activity. The Silk Road traversed some of the most fragile ecosystems on Earth: deserts that could not sustain intensive agriculture, grasslands that could be destroyed by overgrazing, oases that depended on careful water management. The peoples of the Silk Road developed sophisticated techniques for living within these limits, techniques that allowed them to prosper for centuries without exhausting the resources on which they depended. But they also experienced environmental disasters: the drying up of rivers, the advance of deserts, the collapse of irrigation systems that destroyed cities and displaced populations. The environmental challenges we face today are different in scale but similar in kind. Climate change, biodiversity loss, resource depletion. These threaten the foundations of our civilization just as surely as the drying of the Tarim River threatened the oasis cities of the Taklamakan. The Silk Road reminds us that human prosperity depends on ecological health, that we cannot indefinitely take from nature without giving back, that the consequences of environmental degradation may be delayed but are ultimately unavoidable. The dream of endless growth on a finite planet is as illusory as the dream of endless caravans crossing an expanding desert. The sixth lesson concerns the impermanence of human achievements. The Silk Road, which seemed so permanent to those who traveled it, which had existed for so long that it appeared to be a natural feature of the world, came to an end. The maritime revolution of the 15th and 16th centuries rendered it obsolete, and within a few generations, the great cities of the route had declined into obscurity. The caravanserais that had hosted thousands of travelers became ruins. The trade networks that had connected civilizations dissolved. The knowledge and skills that had been passed down for generations were forgotten. This impermanence is not a cause for despair, but a reminder of the contingency of human affairs. Nothing lasts forever, not empires, not trade routes, not ways of life. The systems we depend on today will eventually be replaced by others, just as the Silk Road was replaced by the maritime trade. The question is not whether change will come, but how we will respond to it. Whether we will adapt creatively to new circumstances or cling desperately to obsolete arrangements. Whether we will shape the future or be shaped by it. The Silk Road's end was not a tragedy but a transformation, and the civilizations that emerged from that transformation were in many ways richer and more dynamic than those that preceded them. The seventh and final lesson concerns the power of memory and imagination. The Silk Road died, but it did not disappear. It lived on in the stories people told, in the artifacts they preserved, in the landscapes they inhabited, and when the time was right, it was resurrected, first by archaeologists and scholars, then by tourists and entrepreneurs, finally by governments and international organizations. The Silk Road we speak of today is not the same as the Silk Road of history. It is a construction, an interpretation, a projection of contemporary concerns onto the past. But it is no less real for that. The stories we tell about the past shape the futures we imagine, and the futures we imagine shape the actions we take. The Belt and Road Initiative is, in this sense, an act of imagination as much as an act of engineering. It invokes the Silk Road, not because the ancient routes are literally being rebuilt, but because the idea of the Silk Road, connection, exchange, mutual benefit, resonates with contemporary aspirations. Whether the Belt and Road will succeed in realizing those aspirations remains to be seen. But the very attempt tells us something important about our moment in history, that we are not content with the world as it is, that we dream of something better, that we believe human effort can transform human circumstances. The Silk Road, in the end, is a story about what human beings can achieve when they reach across the barriers that divide them. It is a story of courage and creativity, of persistence and adaptation, of the endless human capacity to find ways around obstacles. It is also a story of greed and violence, of exploitation and suffering, of the dark sides of human nature that accompany even our greatest achievements. It is, in short, a story about us, about who we are, where we come from, and where we might be going. As we stand at the crossroads of the 21st century, facing challenges that would have been unimaginable to the merchants of Samarkand or the monks of Dunhuang, we can draw strength from their example. They too faced a world of uncertainty and danger, of opportunity and risk. They too had to make decisions without knowing how they would turn out, to trust strangers, to venture into the unknown. They too dreamed of connection and prosperity, of understanding and peace. Their dreams were not always realized, but they kept dreaming, kept trying, kept moving forward along the endless road. The Silk Road is not just history, it is a mirror in which we can see ourselves. It shows us what we are capable of, both the heights we can reach and the depths to which we can fall. It reminds us that the choices we make matter, that the actions we take have consequences, that the future is not predetermined but created by human will and human effort. It challenges us to be worthy of the legacy we have inherited, to build connections that will endure, to leave behind a world that is better than the one we found. The road stretches before us, as it stretched before the countless travelers who came before. We do not know where it leads, but we know that we must walk it. The journey continues, as it has always continued, from generation to generation, from civilization to civilization, from the past through the present into the future. The Silk Road is eternal, not because it never changes, but because it is always being reborn, always being reimagined, always being traveled by those who dare to dream of what lies beyond the horizon. And so we end where we began, with a road that leads everywhere and nowhere, with a story that has no ending because it is still being written. The merchants have departed, the caravans have dispersed, the caravanserais have crumbled into dust. But the road remains, waiting for the next traveler, the next dreamer, the next generation to take up the journey. The Silk Road is not behind us, it is ahead of us, stretching into a future we cannot see, but must nonetheless create. The only question is whether we will have the courage to walk it.